My name is Frederick. I am 69 years old, an African-American retired structural engineer who spent decades building solid foundations from the dirt up. Before I reveal what was hiding inside that rusting barn, tell me in the comments where you are watching this from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch someone you love turn into someone you do not recognize. The story begins inside the cold, sterile office of our estate lawyer. The leather chairs squeaked in the deafening silence as the lawyer finished reading Josephine's will. My late wife was a brilliant tech investor, a woman who moved quietly and decisively. Her final directives were simple. Jordan, our 34-year-old son, and an arrogant executive would receive the $18 million Los Angeles penthouse alongside his white wife, Vanessa. I received a single asset. It was a rusty, isolated agricultural plot located in the desolate plains of the Central Valley. Jordan did not offer a single word of condolence for his mother. He did not look at me with sympathy or shared grief. He leaned across the polished mahogany table and extended his hand. He demanded the physical keys to the penthouse immediately. He claimed he needed to change the security codes by the afternoon to secure his new property. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, but the legal parameters were absolute. I reached into my coat pocket, unhooked the heavy brass key ring, and placed it directly into Jordan's open palm. I did not ask questions. I knew my wife better than anyone, and Josephine never made a mistake in her life. There was a reason I was given the farm. Jordan pocketed the keys and stood up, adjusting his tailored suit. He told me to have my things cleared out of the master bedroom by the evening. He walked out of the office with Vanessa clutching his arm, leaving me sitting alone with the lawyer and the echo of a shattered family. The Los Angeles penthouse felt like a museum as I packed my life into a single canvas duffel bag. I stood in the master bedroom folding the few shirts and trousers I owned. Vanessa leaned against the doorframe, watching me with a look of undisguised contempt. She wore a pristine white designer dress, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She pointed a manicured finger at the floor. She complained that my heavy work boots were scuffing the imported Italian marble. She told me my presence in the penthouse completely ruined their modern aesthetic, and that they had already booked an interior decorator to erase any trace of my existence by the weekend. I did not stop packing. I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. Jordan entered the room a moment later, holding a tablet with a list of contractors. He looked at my duffel bag and checked his watch. He told me to leave the property before midnight. He stated that I was nothing but a useless old man who had lived entirely off Josephine's success, contributing nothing of real value to the estate. He claimed my engineering career was an archaic joke compared to his modern corporate achievements. He told me to take my cheap bag and get out of his house. I looked at the boy I had raised. I had spent countless hours teaching him mathematics at the kitchen table, paying for his early failures and bailing him out when his arrogance got the better of him. Now he stood before me as a stranger, entirely consumed by greed. I did not yell at him. I did not remind him of my sacrifices or demand respect. Respect cannot be negotiated or begged for. I zipped my duffel bag shut in complete silence. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder and walked past them without a single backward glance. I stepped into the private elevator, leaving the glittering views of the Los Angeles skyline behind me. I pressed the lobby button and let the steel doors close, severing the final tie to the life I had known. My focus shifted entirely to the road ahead and the rusting farm waiting for me. I drove my old truck directly into a torrential rainstorm. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour as I navigated the treacherous, unlit country roads. Every mile took me further away from the glittering wealth of Los Angeles and deeper into isolation. After 3 hours of driving north, exhaustion set into my bones. I pulled into a cheap, flickering roadside motel just off the interstate. Rain soaked through my jacket as I walked into the cramped reception office. The clerk gave me a tired nod and punched the total into the terminal. I handed him my primary credit card, a joint account I had shared with Josephine for 20 years. The clerk swiped it through the machine. The terminal beeped a harsh, flat rejection. He tried it again. It declined a second time. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking application. The screen loaded, revealing a devastating zero balance. Jordan had moved faster than I anticipated. Using his newfound executive authority and the legal loopholes of the estate transfer, he had completely frozen the joint family accounts. He had locked me out of every single dollar of liquidity I possessed. I had absolutely zero cash in my wallet. I looked at the motel clerk, apologized quietly, and walked back out into the freezing rain. I climbed into the cab of my truck and gripped the steering wheel. Jordan wanted to break me. He wanted me to call him and beg for a place to sleep. He wanted me to surrender. I started the engine and turned the heater on full blast. I had no choice but to drive another 2 hours into the absolute darkness toward the abandoned agricultural plot. It was the only place left in the world where I legally had a right to put a roof over my head. I put the truck into gear and drove straight into the storm, entirely unaware of what Josephine had actually left for me. The storm worsened as I drove 2 hours north into the deep rural stretches of the Central Valley. My old truck fishtailed through thick, unpaved mud while the headlights barely cut through the relentless downpour. I gripped the steering wheel and let the rhythm of the windshield wipers ground me. Jordan wanted me broken. He wanted me sleeping in my truck, forced to beg for a corner of the penthouse I had helped pay for. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I spent 40 years calculating load distributions and stress fractures for commercial high-rises. I knew exactly when a foundation was built to last and when it was designed to collapse. Jordan's entire life was a paper-thin facade built on his mother's silent labor. I arrived at the exact property coordinates Josephine had left me. The headlights swept across a rusted iron gate hanging loosely off its hinges. Beyond it sat a decaying wooden farmhouse surrounded by acres of dead, overgrown crops. A massive, windowless aluminum barn loomed in the distance, nearly swallowed by the darkness. I parked the truck and stepped out into the freezing rain. My structural engineering background made the immediate visual assessment grim. The farmhouse porch sagged heavily to the left, indicating severe foundation rot. The roof shingles curled upward, allowing water to cascade freely through the porch ceiling. This was my entire inheritance. A 34-year-old executive received an $18 million modern marvel, and I received a condemned pile of rotting timber. I pushed open the front door. The wood scraped harshly against the warped floorboards. The air inside smelled of damp earth and deep abandonment. I shined my flashlight across the living room to find it completely barren. There were no chairs, no pictures, and no remnants of a past life. The only object in the entire space was a heavy steel desk sitting dead center in the room. I walked over to it. The surface was immaculate and entirely free of dust, which sharply contrasted with the rest of the ruined structure. I ran my fingers along the cold metal edge. Josephine never did anything without a distinct and calculated purpose. She did not leave me a useless property out of spite. She was a woman who spoke through blueprints and investments. I looked out the broken back window toward the massive aluminum barn. The rain pounded violently against its metal siding. I knew whatever answer my wife left me was waiting out there in the dark. I reached for the wall switch near the door frame and flipped it upward. Nothing happened. The power grid for the main house was entirely dead, the wiring likely chewed through by rodents or disconnected years ago. I pulled my collar tight against the cold and walked back out into the storm. The mud sucked at my heavy work boots as I crossed the overgrown yard toward the massive aluminum barn. Up close, the structure did not match the decaying farmhouse. The corrugated metal siding was pristine and devoid of any rust or weather damage. There were no visible seams, no ventilation grates, and no standard agricultural loading doors. I walked to the primary entrance and shined my flashlight over the heavy steel door. I expected to find a heavy iron padlock or a rusted chain. Instead, my beam illuminated a sleek black rectangular device mounted seamlessly into the metal frame. I wiped the rainwater from the surface. It was a state-of-the-art biometric thumbprint scanner. A subtle green light pulsed beneath the reinforced glass. This was military-grade security equipment completely out of place on a forgotten patch of farmland. I stared at the scanner as the rain beat down on my back. Josephine had worked as a quiet tech investor, operating entirely behind the scenes. She never flaunted her portfolio to our son. Jordan assumed she merely traded modest mutual funds. He never understood the sheer scale of her brilliant mind. I placed my right thumb firmly against the illuminated glass. The machine beeped sharply. The green light flashed blue. A loud, heavy hydraulic hiss echoed through the storm as multiple internal steel deadbolts disengaged at once. The air pressure differential equalized instantly, a clear sign of industrial-grade atmospheric sealing. I had designed facilities with this level of structural integrity before. They were built to withstand severe seismic events and external intrusions. The massive doors swung outward smoothly to reveal utter darkness inside. A rush of dry, intensely cold air hit my face, carrying the distinct, sharp scent of ozone and heated copper. This was not the smell of abandoned farming equipment. I stepped over the threshold and pulled the heavy steel door shut behind me, completely sealing out the violent storm. I raised my flashlight, but I did not need it. Motion sensors detected my presence, and a sequence of overhead lights snapped on to illuminate the cavernous space. I froze completely in my tracks. There was no hay. There were no tractors, no rusted plows, and no bags of fertilizer. The entire interior was a massive temperature-controlled, ultra-secure data center. Row upon row of towering black server racks stretched across the polished concrete floor, humming with an immense and powerful surge of electricity. Thousands of blue LED lights blinked rapidly in the darkness, processing unimaginable amounts of data. The sheer scale of the infrastructure was breathtaking. I walked down the central aisle while the cold air rushed through the ventilation grates beneath my feet. At the very end of the room sat a high-end central control terminal. A crisp white envelope rested precisely on the keyboard. It had my name written across it in Josephine's elegant handwriting. I tore the envelope open. The letter inside was direct. Josephine revealed that this hidden facility held highly classified, long-term server hosting contracts for 3 major Silicon Valley tech giants. The farm generated exactly $250,000 in pure profit every single month. She had purchased the land through a shell corporation to build an invisible empire, specifically keeping it out of the primary estate to hide it from Jordan's reckless greed. But the final paragraph carried a lethal condition. She wrote that to legally execute the transfer of ownership, I had to log into the master terminal and pay a mandatory $20,000 estate transfer tax within 48 hours. The system was currently in a legal suspension mode. If the clock ran out, the automated trust protocol would default the entire facility and all its active contracts directly to Jordan. I looked at the terminal screen. A digital timer was already counting down. I had 46 hours left. I reached into my pocket, remembering the agonizing reality of my situation. Jordan had frozen every joint bank account I had access to just hours ago. I was standing inside a multi-million-dollar gold mine, and I did not have a single dollar to my name. I held Sylvia's letter under the harsh blue glow of the server racks. Her handwriting was sharp and highly deliberate, matching the exact way she handled every aspect of her life. She wrote that she knew the undeniable truth about our son. While Brandon paraded around Los Angeles in custom-tailored suits and leased sports cars, Sylvia had quietly audited his tech startup. She discovered the massive, suffocating debts he was desperately hiding from his investors and his own family. Brandon was bleeding money, living entirely on corporate credit and pure arrogance. She knew that if she left him this highly lucrative server farm directly, he would immediately liquidate the classified tech contracts to cover his tracks, completely destroying everything she had spent a decade building. She designed this decaying agricultural facade specifically to test him. She knew his immense vanity would make him reject the dirt farm without a single second glance, effectively protecting her true financial legacy from his greed. She left the operation to me because I spent over 40 years working as a commercial structural engineer. I was the only person she trusted to maintain a solid foundation and keep a highly complex system running without cutting corners. I placed the letter carefully on the steel desk and turned my full attention to the master control terminal. The dark screen displayed a highly secure login prompt. I typed in the alphanumeric administrative credentials Sylvia had provided at the very bottom of her letter. The system processed the code and immediately locked the main interface with a glaring red notification. The legal transfer protocol required a mandatory $20,000 estate processing fee to officially register my biometric data and release the trust into my name. A digital countdown timer appeared in the top right corner of the screen, actively ticking down from exactly 48 hours. If that processing fee was not paid in full before the clock hit zero, the automated legal system would completely bypass my claim and default the entire asset portfolio directly back to Brandon. Sylvia built this hurdle to ensure I was fully committed to taking over the operation before the transfer finalized. I needed to clear that payment immediately to secure the multi-million-dollar asset. I pulled out my smartphone and opened my primary banking application. I had over $80,000 sitting securely in my personal retirement savings, a completely separate account I had managed entirely on my own for decades. I navigated to the wire transfer section and initiated a direct payment of $20,000 to the routing number displayed on the terminal screen. I pressed confirm. The application froze for 3 long seconds before flashing a critical error message. The transaction was blocked. I tried to transfer a much smaller amount just to test the system integrity. The screen displayed the exact same error stating my account was currently under administrative review. I immediately dialed the 24-hour customer service line for my financial institution. A night shift representative answered and asked for my security verification. I provided my social security number and account details, firmly demanding to know why a routine wire transfer was being rejected. The representative typed loudly on her keyboard before her voice shifted to a tight, overly professional tone. She informed me that she could not authorize any transfers under any circumstances. She explained that my son Brandon had filed an emergency medical directive with the state court just hours earlier. He submitted falsified legal paperwork claiming I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and posed an immediate danger to my own financial well-being. Brandon had weaponized his status as my primary next of kin to trigger a temporary protective hold on all my personal assets. The state had legally frozen my retirement funds, my checking accounts, and my credit lines pending a full psychiatric evaluation. I was completely locked out of my own life savings. Brandon knew I possessed the liquid cash to survive independently. He executed a calculated, preemptive strike to completely neutralize my ability to fight back or secure alternate housing. He wanted to guarantee that I was left entirely destitute, forcing me to crawl back to his Los Angeles penthouse and surrender completely to his control. I thanked the representative with a steady voice and ended the call. The cold reality of the situation set in. I was standing inside a facility generating massive monthly revenue, but I did not have access to a single cent to pay the activation fee. My phone vibrated violently in my hand. The caller ID displayed Brandon's name. I answered the call and pressed the phone to my ear without speaking a single word. Brandon spoke first, his voice dripping with an exaggerated, nauseating tone of fabricated pity. He asked how I was enjoying my first night sleeping in the freezing mud. He told me he felt terribly bad about how things ended at the Penthouse and wanted to make sure I survived the heavy storm. He offered to wire $50 to a prepaid grocery card so I could buy a hot meal at a cheap local diner, openly mocking my living conditions at the rusting farm. He claimed he was simply trying to be a responsible son taking care of his increasingly fragile father. He wanted me to scream at him. He desperately wanted me to curse his name and display the exact erratic behavior of an unstable, angry old man that he had just sold to the state court to freeze my bank accounts. I did not give him a single ounce of emotional satisfaction. I remained perfectly calm, listening to his arrogant breathing over the line, and then I simply ended the call. I placed my phone on the metal desk and looked back up at the master terminal. The digital countdown timer had just slipped below the 24-hour mark. The clock was rapidly bleeding away my only chance to secure Sylvia's true legacy. I closed my eyes and tuned out the heavy hum of the surrounding server racks. I analyzed the dire situation like an engineer confronting a critical structural failure. I thought about my late wife and remembered a crucial defining detail about how Sylvia managed her immense wealth. She built an absolute fortune in the modern digital technology space, but she inherently distrusted digital banking institutions. She always believed that software could be easily manipulated and accounts could be frozen by corrupt corporate bureaucrats. Sylvia never left her ultimate survival up to a remote digital network. She always kept a physical, untraceable failsafe hidden somewhere on the premises. I stood in the dark, cold farmhouse with only the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Josephine never left her survival to digital networks. She always built a physical failsafe. I just had to find it. I spent 40 years calculating structural loads, examining foundational stress points, and finding the hidden flaws in concrete and steel. I knew how spaces were built, which meant I knew exactly how to hide something within them. I walked through the decaying rooms, stomping my heavy boots against the wooden floorboards. I was listening for the resonance, the slight hollow echo that indicated a void between the subfloor and the earth below. The living room was solid. The kitchen was solid. I moved into the cramped, empty bedroom at the back of the house. I opened the small closet and tapped the heel of my boot against the far corner. The sound shifted. It was a dull, hollow thud. I went to my truck, grabbed a steel crowbar from my toolbox, and returned to the closet. I drove the curved end of the crowbar into the seam between the floorboards and applied all my weight. The rusted nails screamed as the wood splintered and gave way. I pulled back 3 loose planks and shined my flashlight into the dark cavity beneath the house. Bolted directly into the concrete foundation block was a heavy titanium floor safe. It was immaculate, completely untouched by the damp rot surrounding it. I wiped the dust off the top to reveal a digital keypad. A small liquid crystal display lit up with a harsh red glow. The text on the screen stated that the safe was equipped with an internal thermal incendiary protocol. I had exactly 3 attempts to enter the correct 6-digit code. If I failed, the system would instantly ignite and incinerate whatever was stored inside to ash. Josephine did not play games. She designed this to be impenetrable to anyone who did not truly know her mind. I knelt on the splintered floorboards, staring at the glowing keypad, knowing my entire future depended on understanding my late wife better than our greedy son did. I hovered my finger over the keypad. The cold metal of the safe seemed to mock my hesitation. I tried to think like Josephine, a woman who calculated every variable. I started with the most obvious choice. I typed in her birth date, assuming she might have used a simple foundational number for a physical lock. The keypad let out a sharp grating beep. The screen flashed a warning. Attempt 1 failed. 2 attempts remaining. My heart rate accelerated. I took a deep breath to steady my hands. I moved to the next logical sequence. I entered the date of our wedding anniversary, the day we promised to build our lives together from the ground up. I pressed the final digit. The system emitted another harsh beep. The screen flashed bright red. Attempt 2 failed. Final attempt remaining. System lockdown and incineration armed. I pulled my hand back as if the metal had burned me. I closed my eyes and tuned out the sound of the rain beating against the roof. Josephine would never use a sentimental date. She was a pragmatist. She built this entire farm as a test to protect her wealth from Jordan. The code had to be tied to the core reason this test existed in the first place. I remembered a massive, bitter argument that tore through our household years ago. Jordan had just driven his expensive car back home, announcing he was quitting university because he wanted to be an entrepreneur with our money. Josephine had looked him dead in the eye and refused to write him a check. She told him that self-reliance was the only currency that mattered, and that a man who abandons his foundation will eventually see his house collapse. I remembered the exact day that argument happened, the exact day Jordan chose arrogance over hard work. It was October 14th, 2010. I reached out and typed the numbers 101410. The keypad beeped. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed from deep within the titanium box. The screen turned a solid, reassuring green. The heavy steel locking bolts retracted smoothly. I pulled the heavy lid open, feeling a rush of absolute relief wash over my tired body. I had passed her ultimate test. Inside the safe sat $50,000 in neatly banded $100 bills. Resting directly on top of the cash was a thick physical USB override key. I grabbed the cash and the key, completely ignoring the dust and splinters on my clothes. I ran out of the farmhouse and sprinted through the freezing mud back to the massive aluminum barn. I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner, forced the heavy doors open, and rushed down the aisle of blinking server racks. I reached the master terminal and shoved the physical key into the secure port. The screen immediately bypassed the restricted lock. I deposited the $20,000 estate transfer fee, using the routing numbers from a secure holding account Josephine had linked to the drive. The transaction processed instantly. The terminal flashed a bright green confirmation message. The entire facility and all its highly classified Silicon Valley tech contracts were now officially registered in my name. I let out a massive sigh, wiping the rainwater from my face. I had secured the asset and completely outmaneuvered Jordan's attempt to leave me destitute. But before I could even step away from the desk, the main terminal flashed a blaring yellow high-priority alert. A secure automated message populated the center of the screen. It was an executive financial notification from the primary tech contractor. A quarterly dividend check for $1.2 million had been physically mailed out yesterday morning. My eyes scanned the delivery details, and my blood ran completely cold. The massive check was not mailed to the secure facility. It had been dispatched to the primary billing address on file. That address was the Los Angeles Penthouse. I stared at the glowing monitor in absolute horror. Jordan and Vanessa were sitting in that exact penthouse right now, celebrating their hostile takeover. The courier package containing over $1 million in pure profit was heading straight into their greedy hands. I had won the facility, but my ruthless son was about to intercept the ultimate financial prize. I grabbed my phone, knowing the war was far from over. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard of the master control terminal. The high priority alert flashed a brilliant yellow against the dark screen displaying the courier tracking number for the $1.2 million dividend check. I quickly accessed the logistics portal embedded within the server network, attempting to intercept the physical routing protocol. I needed to issue an emergency redirect command to halt the delivery vehicle before it reached the downtown Los Angeles district. I typed the administrative override codes Josephine had programmed into the secure system. The progress bar loaded across the screen, calculating the exact geolocation of the armored courier van. I hit the final execution key and waited for the green confirmation signal. The system froze for 2 agonizing seconds before a sharp red notification completely filled the monitor. I was exactly 5 minutes too late. The tracking interface updated instantly, displaying a digital signature captured at the exact moment of delivery. The package had just been accepted and signed for by Vanessa at the Penthouse lobby. My hands hovered over the keyboard as the reality of the situation solidified in my mind. The courier had handed over a certified document representing a massive fortune directly into the hands of the enemy. I knew exactly how my son and his wife operated. Federal mail tampering laws and basic human decency meant absolutely nothing to them. They would not set the envelope aside out of respect for my late wife. The heavy tamper evidence seal would be torn open the second the elevator doors closed. They would see the staggering amount of money printed on that check, and they would immediately realize the decaying agricultural farm I inherited was actually the epicenter of Josephine's entire financial empire. The illusion of my worthlessness was completely shattered. I leaned back in the steel chair and stared at the blinking blue lights of the server racks. The structural integrity of my isolation had just been breached. Jordan thought he had exiled a helpless, financially ruined old man to rot in the mud. Now he possessed physical proof that the very mud he mocked was actively generating millions of dollars. The dynamic of power had violently shifted. I did not panic. I simply closed the tracking window on the terminal, locked the primary interface, and prepared my mind for the inevitable explosive reaction. The silence inside the server barn broke exactly 4 minutes later. The harsh vibration of my mobile phone echoed against the metal walls. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I let it ring 3 times to establish a rhythm of hesitation before I pressed the answer button. I held the device to my ear without speaking. The voice that came through the speaker was completely unrecognizable from the man who had thrown me out into the freezing rain just hours earlier. Jordan did not sound arrogant. He did not sound dismissive. His tone was overly sweet, dripping with a fabricated, suffocating affection. He called me Dad, a word he had practically abandoned over the last decade. He immediately launched into a heavily rehearsed apology, claiming he was simply overwhelmed by the stress of his mother's sudden passing and the heavy burden of managing the estate. He insisted that his cruel words at the Penthouse were a massive mistake fueled by grief and exhaustion. He begged me to pack my things and come straight back to Los Angeles so we could heal together as a family. The sudden influx of false warmth was entirely sickening. He knew about the money. He had opened the courier package, seen the 7-figure dividend, and instantly calculated that he needed me back under his absolute control to access those funds. I did not confront his blatant lies. I utilized the exact perception he already held of me. I played the role of the tired, confused, and thoroughly defeated old man. I let my voice waver slightly, dropping the pitch to simulate deep exhaustion. I told him the drive through the storm had severely drained my energy and that my memory of the previous night was becoming clouded. I pretended I had absolutely no idea what the mail delivery was about. I acted as if the rusted farm was nothing more than a miserable mistake, a worthless pile of dirt causing me immense physical pain. I gave him short, slow answers, convincing him that my mind was already beginning to fracture under the pressure of the isolation. My calculated performance fed directly into his massive ego. He believed he had successfully manipulated a broken man. He believed he could simply reel me back in and extract the fortune without facing any real resistance. He spoke slower, treating me like a child. Jordan smoothly transitioned to the next phase of his manipulation. He insisted that driving back to the city tonight would be too dangerous for someone in my deteriorating condition. He promised he would drive up to the farm first thing tomorrow morning to bring me proper hot food, warm clothes, and check on my overall health. He told me to just rest and wait for him to arrive to fix everything. I thanked him with a weak, trembling voice and ended the call. The moment the line disconnected, the facade of the frail old man vanished entirely. My posture straightened. I placed the phone back on the metal desk and turned my attention to the secondary monitor on the control terminal. I accessed the external security perimeter network that Josephine had secretly installed around the agricultural property boundary. The screen split into multiple high-definition camera feeds overlooking the dirt road, the main gates, and the decaying farmhouse porch. I watched the live video feeds with cold precision. Jordan was absolutely not waiting until tomorrow morning to secure his financial lifeline. He lied to keep me docile. The night vision camera positioned at the edge of the county highway captured a massive luxury SUV tearing through the thick mud at high speeds. The headlights aggressively pierced the heavy rain, illuminating the rusted iron gates of the farm. Jordan was already here. He had immediately mobilized the second he saw the numbers on that dividend check. But as the vehicle violently swerved onto the property and the high beams washed over the camera lens, I noticed a critical detail. He was not alone in the front seats. He had brought company to handle the situation. The battle for the foundation of this empire was no longer a distant legal threat. It was an immediate physical invasion, and the enemy was parking directly on my front lawn. I quickly minimized the security windows and initiated the lockdown protocols for the master terminal. I had mere seconds to conceal the massive digital infrastructure and prepare the dilapidated farmhouse for their arrival. The true test of my structural resilience was about to begin. I watched the bright headlights cut through the heavy driving rain on the security monitor screen. I had less than 2 minutes before Jordan reached the front porch. I initiated the total lockdown protocol on the master terminal and sprinted down the central aisle of the server racks. The heavy steel doors hissed tightly shut behind my back, sealing the humming data center in absolute silence. I grabbed a jagged, heavily rusted metal plate from the mud and snapped it directly over the biometric scanner. The magnetic latch caught instantly, perfectly disguising the advanced security system as a broken piece of agricultural scrap. I ran across the flooded yard toward the decaying farmhouse. I stripped off my damp jacket and pulled on a frayed, mud-stained flannel shirt I kept in my old duffel bag. I dragged a broken wooden chair onto the sagging front porch and sat down heavily. I slumped my shoulders, dropped my chin to my chest, and let my hands shake slightly in my lap. I completely erased the structural engineer and replaced him with a defeated, confused old man. The luxury vehicle tires crunched violently against the gravel as it skidded to a halt near the porch. The doors opened and Jordan stepped out holding a massive black umbrella over Vanessa. They wore expensive raincoats and spotless designer boots. A third man emerged from the back seat. He wore a bright yellow hard hat and a reflective safety vest, but his hands were entirely clean. Jordan walked up the rotting wooden steps with a wide, fabricated smile plastered across his face. He called out to me with a loud, overly enthusiastic voice, acting as though he had not just thrown me out of his home hours earlier. He claimed they were worried sick about my health in this terrible storm. He pointed to the man in the hard hat. Jordan introduced him as a professional roofing contractor they had hired out of the goodness of their hearts. He said they just wanted to inspect the property and make sure the roof would not collapse on me during the night. I looked up at them with blank, empty, tired eyes and offered a very slow, confused nod. I simply did not speak a single word to them. I watched the men step off the porch and walk into the heavy rain. I tracked the contractor closely as he navigated the muddy perimeter of the property. My decades of experience in structural engineering allowed me to instantly dismantle his disguise. A legitimate roofer would assess the load-bearing beams, the structural sag of the roofline, and the exterior shingles. This man did not look at the farmhouse roof even once. He walked straight past the residential structure and marched directly toward the massive aluminum barn in the back. He pulled a digital meter from his pocket and knelt in the mud near the primary utility junction. He was actively tracing the heavy industrial power lines buried beneath the soil. He was measuring the immense electrical draw required to keep a massive data center running. He was not a roofer. He was a commercial technology appraiser sent to verify the exact value of the server farm hardware. Jordan needed physical confirmation of the asset before he launched his final strike. Vanessa stepped onto the porch and pulled my attention away from the barn. She reached deep into a high-end paper shopping bag and pulled out a very cheap, flimsy plastic container. She popped the tight lid off to reveal a portion of plain cold pasta. She handed me a plastic fork and spoke to me with a slow, highly exaggerated pitch, using the exact tone one would use to pacify a slow toddler. She told me I needed to eat my food to keep my strength up because old men get confused when they are hungry. The sheer condescension radiating from her voice was suffocating. I took the plastic container with a trembling hand. I scooped the cold, flavorless pasta into my mouth and chewed in absolute silence. I swallowed my pride along with the terrible food. Enduring this profound humiliation was a tactical necessity. They needed to believe I was completely broken and entirely harmless. I watched the rain drip from the rotting porch roof while my mind worked relentlessly. I was actively mapping their entire strategy. They knew about the money, and they knew the servers were inside the barn. The only remaining hurdle was removing me from the property deed legally. I scraped the bottom of the plastic container and handed it back to Vanessa with a vacant, compliant expression. She snatched it away with a look of pure disgust. Vanessa shivered intensely and complained very loudly about the freezing dampness of the wooden porch. She pushed past me and walked into the decaying farmhouse to escape the cold wind. I waited 10 seconds before I slowly stood up and followed her inside. The empty living room was completely dark and smelled heavily of old wet wood. Vanessa had walked down the narrow hallway to inspect the dilapidated bathroom. She left her heavy designer leather handbag resting carelessly on top of the rusted kitchen counter. Jordan and the appraiser were still outside in the storm, loudly discussing the electrical grid. I had a narrow window of absolute privacy. I moved toward the counter with swift, silent precision. The image of the frail old man vanished completely. I reached out and quickly popped the brass clasp on her handbag. I bypassed her cosmetic cases and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope tucked into the back compartment. I slid the documents out just far enough to read the bold, capitalized header printed across the top page. It was a formal declaration of mental incompetence. The paperwork was already drafted and signed by a corrupt medical professional. The strategy was brutally clear. They were not going to ask me to sign the farm over, and they were not going to negotiate. They were preparing to legally seize the property by providing state authorities with fabricated proof that I was senile and incapable of managing my own affairs. They wanted to strip away my fundamental human autonomy and lock me in a state-run facility so they could liquidate Josephine's empire. I heard the bathroom door creak open down the hall. Vanessa's heavy heels clicked loudly against the wooden floorboards. I immediately shoved the thick document back into the paper envelope, slipped it deep inside the designer handbag, and snapped the brass clasp shut. I turned around and leaned heavily against the kitchen sink, letting my head drop and my hands shake just as Vanessa walked into the room. Vanessa snatches her heavy designer handbag from the rusted kitchen counter with a look of utter disdain. Jordan walks into the room a second later, casually clapping his hands together, announcing that the roof looks perfectly fine and they will be on their way. They spout a few more fake pleasantries, promising to return soon with more cold food. Frederick simply nods, keeping his hands trembling slightly, staring blankly at the floorboards until the heavy wooden door clicks shut. He listens to the engine of the luxury SUV roar to life and fade down the muddy driveway. The moment the sound completely disappears into the violent storm, Frederick's posture snaps perfectly straight. The illusion of the broken old man evaporates instantly. He moves with practiced engineering efficiency. He walks straight to the bedroom closet and reaches deep into the concealed cavity beneath the floorboards. He extracts the remaining $30,000 in banded $100 bills from Josephine's hidden titanium safe. He throws the heavy stacks of cash into his canvas duffel bag and walks out into the pouring rain. He climbs into his old truck, fires the engine, and drives straight back toward the very city that had just spat him out. It takes 3 hours to reach the towering glass skyscrapers of the Los Angeles financial district. He parks his battered, mud-covered truck between pristine luxury vehicles and walks directly into the most formidable corporate law firm in the entire state. The receptionist attempts to block his path, eyeing his frayed, mud-stained flannel shirt. Frederick bypasses her completely and pushes through the heavy frosted glass doors at the end of the long corridor. He steps into the immaculate, expansive office of Richard Bradley. Bradley is the most ruthless, highly feared corporate attorney on the West Coast. He is also the man who personally constructed the impenetrable legal frameworks surrounding Josephine's hidden empire for over 2 decades. Bradley looks up from his massive mahogany desk, his sharp eyes narrowing in sheer surprise at the sight of the supposedly exiled structural engineer. Frederick does not offer a polite greeting. He unzips his faded canvas duffel bag and dumps $30,000 in banded cash directly onto the polished mahogany wood. He looks Bradley dead in the eye and states that he needs to completely dismantle his own son. Bradley stares at the towering pile of cash on his desk. He does not ask unnecessary questions. He simply sweeps the banded money into a secure drawer and turns to his massive dual-monitor workstation. Frederick instructs Bradley to launch a total uncompromising shadow investigation into every single aspect of Jordan's life, starting directly with his highly publicized technology startup. Bradley's fingers fly across his keyboard, accessing restricted federal financial databases and back-channel corporate registries that Josephine had routinely utilized during her corporate acquisitions. The comprehensive digital audit takes less than 20 minutes to complete. The reality of Jordan's financial situation bleeds across the glowing screens, and the absolute truth is profoundly worse than mere reckless debt. Jordan has not been running a legitimate technology company. He has been operating a sophisticated corporate shell game. The forensic data unequivocally reveals that Jordan actively embezzled $4 million from a notoriously ruthless venture capital firm based in Silicon Valley. He funneled the stolen capital through offshore dummy accounts to blindly finance his lavish Los Angeles lifestyle, the leased luxury cars, and his wife's endless designer wardrobe. But the venture capital firm recently initiated a massive internal audit. They found the gaping holes in the ledger. Bradley pulls up a highly confidential legal injunction filed under seal just 3 days ago. The wealthy investors have given Jordan exactly 2 weeks to return the stolen $4 million in full. If he fails to produce the liquid cash by that absolute deadline, the firm will automatically trigger a federal fraud indictment. Jordan will not just face absolute bankruptcy, he will face a minimum of 10 years in a maximum security federal prison. The entire puzzle instantly clicks into place inside Frederick's mind. Jordan never cared about the decaying agricultural property itself, and he certainly did not care about Josephine's legacy. He had somehow discovered the classified server contracts running beneath the dirt. He desperately needed the immense equity of the server farm to secure an emergency commercial loan. Liquidating Josephine's secret empire is the only way Jordan can replace the embezzled funds and save himself from total destruction. He is completely cornered, entirely desperate, and perfectly willing to legally erase his own father's mind to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. Frederick tells Bradley about the legal document he found hidden inside Vanessa's designer handbag earlier that afternoon. He explains that Jordan is actively planning to deploy a corrupt medical professional to formally declare him mentally incompetent within days. Bradley leans back in his expensive leather chair, a cold, calculating smirk forming on his face. He informs Frederick that fighting a medical injunction takes precious time they simply do not have, so they must build an impenetrable legal fortress around the property immediately. Bradley accesses the county registry system and actively embeds a highly advanced digital tripwire deep within the deed to the Central Valley farm. The sophisticated software protocol is uniquely designed to instantly detect, freeze, and trace any unauthorized attempt to alter the property's chain of title. They sit in the quiet, climate-controlled office, mapping out a brutal counteroffensive to systematically dismantle Jordan's entire fraudulent operation. Frederick drinks a glass of cold water, feeling the solid ground of control finally forming beneath his feet. Suddenly, the serene silence of the corporate office is completely shattered. Bradley's primary computer system blares a harsh, piercing red warning alarm. A massive notification box overrides the dual monitors flashing violently in the dim light. Bradley leans forward, his eyes tracking the rapid flow of data streaming across the screen. The digital tripwire has just been tripped. Someone is actively accessing the county registry portal in real time. Bradley traces the inbound connection directly back to an IP address registered to the Los Angeles Penthouse. Jordan is not waiting for the medical incompetence declaration to process through the slow state courts. The crushing desperation of his 2-week federal deadline has forced his hand early. He is actively attempting to forcefully transfer the absolute deed of the farm into a newly created offshore shell company right this second. And to bypass the heavy legal security measures, Jordan is submitting the electronic transfer forms using a completely fabricated, highly sophisticated forgery of Frederick's own signature. I drove back through the night, leaving the towering glass structures of Los Angeles far behind me. The violent rainstorm had finally broken by the time I reached the Central Valley, leaving the dirt roads to the farm choked with thick, heavy mud. I parked my truck and walked inside the decaying farmhouse, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The digital tripwire Bradley had embedded in the property deed was actively holding the line, but Jordan's failed digital forgery meant a physical attack was imminent. I did not have to wait long. The very next morning, the sound of tires crushing gravel echoed through the damp air. I looked out the broken kitchen window and watched Vanessa's sleek white sports car slide precariously to a halt near the porch. She stepped out alone. She carefully navigated the muddy yard, treating the earth beneath her feet with absolute disgust as she protected her designer heels. I sat at the rusted metal desk in the living room and waited. Vanessa pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside instantly, plastering a bright, aggressively warm smile across her face. The sheer falseness of her expression was almost blinding. She played the role of the devoted, deeply concerned daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. She spoke with a soft, soothing cadence, completely abandoning the venomous tone she had used when she threw me out of the penthouse. She claimed she came all the way up here just to check on my living conditions and make sure I was settling in all right. She placed a pristine leather folder onto the center of the metal desk. She told me the estate transfer had caused a minor administrative glitch with the local utility companies. She pulled out a stack of standard utility bills and fanned them out across the steel surface. She explained that the power grid and the water lines required my direct physical signature to keep the basic services running. She handed me a heavy gold pen, telling me she just wanted to make sure I did not have to spend another night freezing in the dark. I looked at the glossy bills and then at her unblinking, expectant eyes. I reached out and slowly pulled the stack of papers closer to the edge of the desk. My decades of engineering experience trained my eyes to spot microscopic structural misalignments. I immediately noticed that the bottom edge of the stack was slightly thicker than the rest. The edges of the paper did not perfectly match the standard dimensions of a municipal utility bill. I casually slid my thumb along the corner of the top sheet, shifting the water bill just a fraction of an inch to the left. Buried perfectly beneath the mundane invoices was a dense, legally binding document. My eyes caught the bold, capitalized letters printed across the hidden header. It was a comprehensive power of attorney transfer. Vanessa was not here to keep the lights on. She was here to trick me into legally signing away my absolute autonomy and transferring the complete authority of the estate directly to Jordan. If my ink touched that bottom page, Jordan could instantly liquidate the server farm and clear his embezzled debts before sunset. I did not confront her. I did not let my heart rate spike or my breathing change. I leaned heavily into the exact persona they had meticulously crafted for me. I let my shoulders sag and let my jaw hang slightly slack. I acted hopelessly confused by the simple printed words in front of me. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and fumbled with the hinges, letting my hands shake violently. I muttered nonsensical questions about the dates on the bills, pretending I could not comprehend basic numbers. Vanessa leaned forward, her mask of patience visibly cracking as her greed pushed her to rush me. She pointed a manicured finger directly at the signature line, urging me to just sign quickly so she could take care of the rest. I picked up the gold pen with a trembling grip. I reached for the steaming mug of black coffee sitting on the edge of the metal desk. I intentionally misjudged the distance. The side of my wrist slammed hard against the ceramic mug. The heavy cup tipped over instantly, sending a tidal wave of scalding hot dark liquid surging across the steel desk and directly toward Vanessa's lap. She unleashed a piercing shriek. She scrambled backward in sheer panic, throwing her arms up and violently twisting her body away to save her pristine white dress and expensive shoes from the boiling stain. The split second of violent chaos was all the cover I needed. While Vanessa was completely distracted by the scalding spill, I moved with calculated, absolute precision. I smoothly slid the power of attorney document out from beneath the stack of utility bills and dropped it straight into the open drawer of the desk. I immediately pulled a blank, crumpled grocery receipt from my pocket and slid it into the exact same position beneath the water bill. I grabbed the gold pen and violently scribbled a shaky, illegible signature across the soaking wet paper. Vanessa finally regained her balance, her chest heaving with furious, unmasked anger. She glared at the coffee dripping off the edge of the desk, completely abandoning her sweet facade. She snatched the wet stack of papers off the metal surface without bothering to double-check the bottom sheet. She shoved the dripping documents roughly into her leather folder, cursed under her breath about the filthy conditions of the farm, and marched straight out the front door. I stood in the kitchen and watched her car speed away through the mud. I walked over to the rusted stove and reached beneath the wooden cabinet overhang. Earlier that morning, I had mounted a high-frequency, motion-activated audio recorder directly above the sink. I pulled the device down and pressed the playback button. The digital file loaded the audio captured during the exact moment Vanessa had retreated to the hallway to inspect her shoes. Her voice echoed clearly through the small speaker as she dialed her phone. She excitedly told Jordan she had secured the signature. Jordan's voice replied through the external speaker of her phone. He sounded entirely unimpressed. He coldly informed his wife that the forged signature was merely a secondary backup plan. He stated that relying on a messy paper trail was too risky for a $4 million deficit. He told Vanessa he had already finalized the primary strike. He had successfully wired a massive cash bribe to Dr. Vance, a highly corrupt physician known for facilitating hostile estate takeovers. Jordan proudly announced that the doctor was scheduled to arrive at the farm early tomorrow morning to conduct a forced medical ambush. I sat in the dim kitchen listening to the heavy tires of Jordan's luxury SUV crush the gravel of the driveway. It was barely past dawn. The freezing morning mist still clung to the rotting wooden beams of the porch. Jordan did not bother knocking. He pushed the heavy front door open, letting the cold air sweep through the house. He stepped into the living room accompanied by a tall, sharply dressed man carrying a sleek black medical bag. Jordan wore a tight, uncomfortable smile. He announced that he had brought a specialist to check on my blood pressure. He claimed the stress of the storm and my recent isolation had him deeply concerned about my physical well-being. He introduced the man as Dr. Vance. I recognized the name immediately from the hidden audio recording. Dr. Vance was not a cardiologist. He was a highly corrupt physician who specialized in providing fraudulent medical documentation for hostile estate takeovers. He built his entire lucrative career by legally erasing the autonomy of wealthy elderly targets. The doctor did not waste a single second on bedside manner. He dropped his heavy leather bag onto the rusted metal desk and pulled out a blood pressure cuff, but his eyes remained completely cold and intensely focused on my face. He strapped the cuff to my arm and pumped it tight, immediately launching into a barrage of questions. He did not ask about my physical health. He asked about the exact layout of the property, the specific dates of my late wife's financial acquisitions, and the precise routing numbers of the local bank accounts. He was actively mapping my cognitive boundaries, looking for the slightest hesitation or sign of mental decay. I let my shoulders slump forward. I adjusted my posture to mimic a fragile, intimidated old man. I breathed shallowly, allowing the blood pressure monitor to register a slightly elevated heart rate. Jordan stood by the doorway, crossing his arms with a look of absolute triumph. He believed the trap was perfectly sprung. He thought the sheer intimidation of a medical authority figure would force my mind to fracture. Dr. Vance unfastened the cuff and tossed it aside. He pulled a thick stack of medical evaluation forms from his bag and clicked a heavy silver pen. The physical charade was over. The aggressive cognitive assault had officially begun. Dr. Vance fired rapid, heavily disorienting questions across the metal desk. He demanded I recite complex numerical sequences backward. He ordered me to recall the exact dates of obscure tax filings from a decade ago. He rapidly switched topics from municipal zoning codes to the maiden names of distant relatives. The interrogation was specifically designed to overwhelm the nervous system and induce immediate mental fatigue. I sat perfectly still in the broken wooden chair. I did not blink and I did not let my hands tremble. I answered every single question with terrifying calculated precision. I recited the tax dates flawlessly. I listed the zoning codes without a fraction of a second of hesitation. I watched the arrogant smirk slowly melt off Dr. Vance's face. He glanced nervously at Jordan, whose confident posture was rapidly dissolving into rigid panic. They realized I was not a senile, confused old man. My mind was a steel trap, forged by 40 years of high-level structural engineering. The doctor flipped through his evaluation forms, desperately searching for a psychological vulnerability. He slammed his silver pen against the desk and loudly demanded that I identify the specific make and model of the first car Jordan ever drove. This was my moment. I knew exactly what vehicle Jordan drove. It was a silver German sports coupe purchased entirely with Josephine's money on his 18th birthday. But I needed them to feel victorious. I needed them to proceed with their fraudulent scheme so the federal trap could close around them completely. I let my eyes glaze over. I stared blankly at the wall for 5 agonizing seconds. I stammered, letting my voice crack with fabricated uncertainty. I told them it was a blue American sedan. I muttered that my memory was getting foggy regarding the older details of my son's childhood. I rubbed my forehead and looked down at the floorboards, portraying a man utterly defeated by his own decaying mind. The heavy tension in the room instantly vanished. Jordan let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He looked at the doctor and nodded slowly. That single, perfectly calculated mistake was exactly what they needed. It validated their entire narrative of my mental decline. Their arrogance completely blinded them to the flawless precision of my previous answers. They had exactly what they came for. Dr. Vance smirked broadly and pulled the final evaluation sheet from his leather bag. He quickly scribbled his signature across the bottom line, officially finalizing a preliminary diagnosis of early-onset dementia. He handed the carbon copy to Jordan, confirming that the legal framework for the forced guardianship was now fully established. They did not say goodbye. Jordan tucked the fraudulent medical document into his expensive jacket and walked out the front door looking like a man who had just conquered the world. The heavy tires of the SUV crushed the gravel as they sped away from the property. I waited until the engine noise completely faded into the distance. I reached beneath the collar of my flannel shirt and tapped the hidden transmitter taped to my chest. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket and ended the secure application. The entire hostile medical ambush, including the aggressive questioning and the blatantly corrupt diagnosis, had been captured through a hidden micro camera and live-streamed directly to Bradley's secure legal servers in Los Angeles. We now possessed irrefutable federal evidence of medical fraud and conspiracy. I allowed myself a cold, hard smile. The trap was perfectly set. Before I could even stand up from the desk, my phone vibrated violently in my hand. The caller identification displayed Bradley's direct line. I pressed the answer button, expecting a confirmation of the recording. Bradley did not offer a greeting. His voice was sharp and laced with unprecedented urgency. He told me the federal evidence we just collected might not be enough to stop the bleeding in time. Jordan had radically accelerated his timeline to cover his $4 million embezzlement debt. Bradley's automated financial trackers had just detected a massive real estate listing. Jordan had circumvented the frozen farm deed completely. He had just listed the $18 million Los Angeles penthouse for sale on an exclusive international market. He was offering the estate at a severe discount to a foreign buyer for an immediate untraceable cash transfer. I sprinted back through the freezing downpour and slapped my palm against the concealed biometric scanner of the server barn. The heavy steel doors hissed open and I rushed to the master control terminal. Bradley was already transmitting the encrypted real estate documents directly to my secure monitor from his Los Angeles office. We needed to find a critical structural flaw in the penthouse deed before the international wire transfer cleared the banking system. I opened the digital blueprints of the property trust. Josephine was a master architect of corporate law, and she built rigorous safeguards into everything she owned. Bradley instructed me to bypass the primary deed and access the nested subtrust files hidden deep within the estate portfolio. I scanned the dense legal jargon, my eyes hunting for the foundational load-bearing clauses. I found it buried on page 47. Josephine had known exactly who she was raising. She had watched Jordan burn through his college tuition, crash expensive cars, and demand endless financial bailouts without a single ounce of remorse. She fully anticipated his reckless greed long before her death. To protect the Los Angeles penthouse from his inevitable financial disasters, she quietly embedded a strict morality and stability clause deep within the nested property trust. The penthouse did not belong to Jordan directly. It was technically held in a rigid subtrust specifically designed to prevent immediate liquidation. The clause explicitly mandated that Jordan could not legally sell, borrow against, or transfer the asset without the notarized physical signature of the primary estate trustee. He was attempting to bypass this legal roadblock using his forged documents, but the foreign buyer was dealing with the wrong legal entity entirely. Josephine had laid a trap of pure bureaucracy. She structured the trust so that any unilateral attempt to sell the property would automatically trigger a mandatory review by the primary trustee. Jordan thought he held the keys to the castle. He did not realize his mother had changed the locks years ago. He was trying to sell a building he did not legally control. I stared at the blinking cursor on the bright screen. The name listed as the sole primary estate trustee was mine, Frederick Dominic. I held the absolute veto power over the $18 million transaction. I quickly relayed the exact clause designation and the specific trust identification numbers to Bradley. He did not waste a single millisecond. He immediately drafted an emergency federal injunction citing the morality and stability clause. He explicitly named Jordan's ongoing medical fraud and the active federal investigation into his venture capital embezzlement as clear, undeniable violations of the trust's terms. Bradley accessed the federal judicial portal and filed the injunction directly with a highly sympathetic federal judge he kept on speed dial. The legal counterstrike moved with the devastating speed of a guided missile. Bradley simultaneously routed the certified injunction directly to the international escrow agency managing the penthouse sale. We watched the live transaction log stream across the secure monitor. The foreign buyer had already initiated the massive wire transfer. $18 million of untraceable overseas funds were actively routing through the global banking network, bouncing from offshore accounts toward Jordan's designated shell company. The progress bar reached 99%. Jordan was mere seconds away from clearing his embezzlement debt and securing his absolute freedom. Then the federal injunction slammed into the escrow server. The transaction window froze violently. A stark red notification flashed across my screen. The title company immediately locked the property deed. The escrow agents, absolutely terrified of violating a direct federal court order, completely halted the incoming wire transfer. The funds were instantly rejected and bounced back to the foreign buyer. The sale was officially dead. I let out a long, slow breath, watching the red failure notification pulse on the monitor. Jordan's emergency escape hatch was permanently sealed shut. He had tried to steal my mind, and in return I had completely severed his financial lifeline. We had built an impenetrable wall around his only valuable asset, leaving him entirely exposed to the ruthless venture capital firm he had defrauded. The fallout was instantaneous. Bradley tapped into the real estate broker's communication network using Josephine's old corporate surveillance protocols. We listened to the live audio feed as the international buyer's legal representation frantically called Jordan's real estate agent. The foreign investors were absolutely furious. They demanded an immediate withdrawal from the contract, aggressively citing the messy legal encumbrances and the sudden federal freeze on the title. They permanently pulled their lucrative offer off the table. Less than 2 minutes later, the panicked real estate agent dialed Jordan. I listened to the raw, unfiltered audio of my son receiving the news. The agent stammered through the explanation, informing Jordan that the title was federally locked and the massive cash transfer had been completely rejected by the bank. She read the name of the primary trustee who filed the injunction. My name. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. The meticulously crafted mask of the grieving, loving son shattered into a million jagged pieces. Jordan unleashed a guttural, terrifying scream of pure, unadulterated rage. He smashed something heavy and glass against a wall, cursing my name with a violent, venomous hatred. He realized the medical ambush had failed. He realized the forged power of attorney had failed. He realized the confused, senile old man he had mocked and discarded was actively tearing his life apart brick by brick. Jordan slammed the phone down, disconnecting the line. I switched my monitor back to the external security cameras. 10 minutes later, the cameras outside the Los Angeles Penthouse captured Jordan storming out of the private parking garage. He did not look like a polished technology executive. He looked like a cornered rabid animal. He threw himself into his luxury SUV, completely ignoring the parking valet. The tires shrieked against the concrete pavement as he aggressively accelerated into the busy street. He was no longer hiding behind fake smiles or corrupt doctors. He was coming straight for the farm, and he was coming to end this war with his own 2 hands. I heard the roar of the luxury engine tearing down the dirt road long before the headlights swept across the living room windows. The heavy vehicle did not slow down as it approached the decaying farmhouse. It skidded wildly across the flooded grass, tearing deep, violent trenches into the front lawn before slamming to a halt just inches from the wooden porch steps. I remained seated in my weathered leather armchair in the center of the dim room, the hot mug of black coffee resting perfectly steady in my hand. The heavy wooden front door did not simply swing open, it exploded inward. Jordan drove his expensive leather boot directly into the deadbolt with terrifying force. The thick wood splintered violently, the brass lock tearing completely through the door frame as the heavy oak panel crashed onto the floorboards. The freezing wind and driving rain instantly whipped through the narrow hallway, but Jordan did not care. He stomped into the room looking like a deranged, rabid stranger. His designer suit jacket was soaked and completely disheveled, clinging to his arms. His face was flushed crimson with pure, unadulterated rage. The meticulously crafted mask of the grieving, supportive son was entirely gone, completely incinerated by the raw desperation of a cornered criminal facing a decade in federal prison. He did not ask how I was doing. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and unleashed a torrent of vicious, echoing screams. He demanded that I pick up my phone right this second and call Bradley. He ordered me to lift the federal injunction on the Penthouse title immediately, so the international wire transfer could clear. When I did not flinch or reach for the device, his volume escalated to a deafening, hysterical pitch. He paced aggressively around the small room, kicking over a wooden side table and shattering a glass lamp against the wall. He threatened to drag me out into the mud by my throat. He shouted that if I did not release the property deed within the next 5 minutes, he would dial the local authorities and fabricate a violent domestic dispute. He promised to tell the arriving officers that I had suffered a severe psychotic break and physically assaulted him with a heavy weapon. He was perfectly willing to manufacture a felony assault charge just to have me dragged out of my own house in handcuffs. He loomed over my chair, panting heavily, his eyes wide and frantic, waiting for the frail old man to finally break under the sheer weight of his physical intimidation. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not shrink back into the worn upholstery of the armchair. Decades spent inspecting compromised structural foundations high above the ground had taught me exactly how to breathe through moments of imminent physical collapse. Panic is a choice, and it was a choice I completely refused to make. I slowly raised the ceramic mug to my lips and took a deliberate, measured sip of the hot black coffee. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the ambient sound of the rain beating against the tin roof to underscore his complete lack of control. I looked up at the man standing before me. He was 35 years old, wearing clothes he did not pay for, driving a car he did not own, and trying to steal a massive fortune he did not build. He was an absolute fundamental failure of character. I placed my mug gently onto the wooden coaster. I maintained unwavering eye contact and kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away all the feigned exhaustion and confusion I had projected over the last few days. I told him he had made a fatal miscalculation. I stated with absolute cutting clarity, "You traded your father for a penthouse, and now you have neither." The absolute certainty in my voice struck him like a physical blow to the chest. He froze, clearly disoriented by the sudden evaporation of the senile persona he had relied upon to execute his scheme. He realized in that specific moment that I had been playing him from the very beginning. The realization did not elicit a single ounce of remorse or shame. It only deepened his malignant desperation. His shock rapidly morphed back into a cruel, twisted sneer. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed strangely through the destroyed entryway. He stood up completely straight and aggressively adjusted the soaked lapels of his ruined suit jacket. He reached into his inner breast pocket and withdrew a thick, tri-folded legal document. The heavy paper was embossed with the bright blue seal of the state county court. He slapped the document down onto the center of my coffee table, tapping his knuckles hard against the thick parchment. He leaned in close, his breath hot and ragged, and informed me that my little legal trick with the trust injunction was completely irrelevant. He proudly announced that he had brought a far superior weapon to a financial gunfight. I glanced down at the bold black lettering printed across the top of the official court stationery. It was an emergency ex parte order granting temporary legal guardianship. Jordan had absolutely bypassed the standard lengthy judicial review process. He had utilized Dr. Vance's fraudulent medical diagnosis of early onset dementia and paired it with a massive untraceable cash bribe to a highly corrupt municipal judge. The document sitting on my table legally declared me an immediate critical danger to myself and officially stripped me of all my fundamental civil rights. Jordan sneered down at me, clearly relishing the administrative violence he had just unleashed. He explained the brutal, efficient mechanics of his victory. The temporary guardianship granted him immediate, unchecked executive control over my medical decisions and my entire financial portfolio. He did not need to negotiate the lifting of the Penthouse injunction with me or Bradley. With this specific document, he held the absolute legal authority to rescind the injunction himself on my behalf. He checked the expensive gold watch on his wrist with a theatrical, arrogant flourish. He leaned down until we were perfectly eye to eye. He told me that the county sheriff's department had already been dispatched. In exactly 12 hours, a heavily armed medical transport team would arrive at this farmhouse to forcefully remove me from the premises. He promised I would spend the rest of my natural life heavily sedated in the locked ward of a state-run psychiatric facility, stripped of my assets, and entirely forgotten by the world. He turned his back on me without another word. He stepped over the shattered remains of the front door and walked out into the freezing rain, completely convinced he had secured his fortune and definitively won the war. I sat alone in the dim living room, listening to his engine fade away, staring at the blue judicial seal on the table. The final countdown had officially begun. I had exactly 12 hours to completely dismantle his forged legal authority before the police arrived to permanently take my freedom. The clock is ticking. It is exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. 12 hours means 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Frederick moves over the splintered remains of the front door. He barricades the ruined entryway with heavy iron chains and industrial padlocks from his toolbox, ensuring no one can easily slip inside. He strides through the freezing rain straight to the massive aluminum barn. He presses his thumb to the biometric scanner, tearing away the rusted metal plate. The heavy steel doors seal shut behind him, locking out the violent storm and locking him inside the humming sanctuary of Josephine's data center. He boots up the master terminal and establishes a secure, heavily encrypted video link to Bradley's office in Los Angeles. Bradley appears on the high-definition monitor, looking completely wide awake despite the late hour. Frederick holds the temporary guardianship order up to the camera lens. Bradley's face hardens into a mask of pure professional fury. He recognizes the signature of the municipal judge immediately. It is a man notorious for fast-tracking ex parte orders for wealthy clients willing to pay exorbitant backdoor fees. Bradley states the grim reality of their situation. A temporary guardianship order granted by a sitting judge cannot simply be ignored. When the medical transport team arrives accompanied by the county sheriff, they will have the absolute legal authority to break down the doors and forcibly sedate Frederick. The only way to stop the transport team is to definitively prove that the guardianship order was obtained through explicit criminal fraud. They must find the exact financial link between Jordan Dr. Vance and the corrupt municipal judge before the sun rises. If they fail to provide absolute, undeniable proof of a massive financial bribe, the federal authorities will not intervene and Frederick will lose his freedom, his mind, and his entire estate. The digital clock on the terminal flashes 8:30. Frederick pulls up the primary command interface for the server farm. Josephine built this specific data center to process high-frequency algorithmic trading for elite international firms. It possessed a computing capacity that dwarfed standard financial institutions. Frederick tells Bradley that they are no longer going to play defense. He reroutes the liquid cooling systems, pushing the servers to their absolute maximum capacity. The low hum of the room shifts into a deep, aggressive roar. He is going to use Josephine's billion-dollar infrastructure to rip his son's financial history down to the studs. Frederick bypasses the standard corporate firewalls and deploys a suite of military-grade forensic auditing software Josephine had acquired years ago to protect her assets. He links the software directly to the investigation files Bradley had already pulled on Jordan's failing technology startup. The massive server farm begins tearing through Jordan's entire digital existence. Frederick watches the multiple screens as lines of code stream past at blinding speeds. The system sifts through thousands of encrypted banking transactions, credit card statements, and deleted email archives. Jordan thought he was a sophisticated criminal, but he was nothing more than a desperate amateur, leaving a massive, incredibly messy digital footprint. Frederick programs the auditing software to specifically hunt for anomalous offshore wire transfers executed within the last 48 hours. The servers instantly isolate Jordan's hidden Cayman Islands accounts, the very same accounts he used to hide the $4 million he embezzled from the venture capital firm. At exactly 3 in the morning, the primary monitor flashes a bright green confirmation signal. Frederick leans closer to the screen, his eyes tracking the red highlighted routing numbers. Jordan had made 2 massive consecutive wire transfers completely separate from his standard operating expenses. The first transfer was for $200,000 routed directly into a blind corporate shell company registered in Panama. Bradley runs a rapid cross-reference algorithm on the Panamanian company and instantly matches the executive board members directly to Dr. Vance. The second wire transfer was even larger, a $500,000 payment sent to a discreet real estate holding trust based in the Bahamas. Bradley laughs coldly through the video feed. He recognizes the Bahamian trust perfectly. It is the exact entity the corrupt municipal judge uses to purchase luxury vacation properties without reporting the income to the Internal Revenue Service. Frederick downloads the raw transaction logs capturing the exact timestamps, routing codes, and IP addresses Jordan used to authorize the bribes. The evidence is absolutely flawless and entirely indisputable. Jordan had successfully purchased a fraudulent medical diagnosis and a corrupt judicial order, but he had carelessly documented his own federal crimes in the process. Frederick compiles the data packets and transmits the highly encrypted files directly to Bradley. It is 5 in the morning. They have exactly 3 hours left to stop the police. Bradley immediately packages the raw financial data into a comprehensive federal legal dossier. At exactly 6 in the morning, he forces a direct high-priority line to the federal district judge who had previously frozen the Penthouse deed. Bradley files an emergency federal counter-injunction officially requesting the immediate suspension of the county guardianship order based on explicit, undeniable evidence of judicial bribery and medical fraud. He also forwards the unredacted wire transfer logs directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. The federal judge reviews the staggering evidence and acts with unprecedented furious speed. By 6:45 in the morning, a permanent federal stay is placed on the local court order. The county sheriff and the medical transport team are ordered to stand down completely. Frederick leans back in his metal chair, listening to the heavy rain finally begin to subside outside the aluminum barn. His freedom is permanently secured. But as Bradley monitors Jordan's active credit accounts for any further desperate movements, a bizarre and massive expenditure triggers a new alert on the screen. Bradley pulls up a series of fresh, massive invoices billing directly to Jordan's remaining corporate credit lines. Jordan has not gone into hiding. He has radically escalated his own delusional narrative. To project an image of extreme, untouchable liquidity and actively prevent his suspicious venture capital investors from discovering his massive embezzlement, Jordan has rented out the entire rooftop of his building. He is hosting a lavish million-dollar gala at the Penthouse that very evening. He has hired elite caterers, private security teams, and a string quartet throwing a massive celebration to convince his ruthless investors that his technology company is thriving and wildly profitable. Frederick stares at the digital invitations Bradley intercepts. Jordan intends to stand in front of the very people he robbed and smile, completely unaware that his father holds the absolute proof of his federal crimes. Frederick tells Bradley to prepare the final devastating legal documents. The war will not end in the freezing mud of the Central Valley. It will end tonight in front of everyone Jordan desperately wants to impress. The flashing red and blue lights cut fiercely through the lingering morning mist, casting harsh rotating shadows against the corrugated aluminum siding of the server barn. I stepped out into the damp, freezing air and watched 3 county sheriff cruisers aggressively surround the muddy driveway. 2 heavily armored medical transport vans parked directly behind them, their engines idling with a low, menacing rumble. Uniformed deputies stepped out into the rain-soaked grass, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. The lead sheriff carried the fraudulent ex parte order Jordan had purchased, clearly expecting to find a delusional, violent old man who needed to be forcefully subdued and dragged away in restraints. They did not expect to find Bradley leaning casually against the rusted hood of my truck. Bradley had chartered a private helicopter from Los Angeles the exact moment the federal judge signed the counter-injunction, touching down on the flooded north pasture just 20 minutes before the local authorities arrived. The lead sheriff marched toward the wooden porch, holding the county document high and demanding my immediate surrender. Bradley did not let him speak a single word. He stepped forward and shoved the thick federal dossier directly into the sheriff's chest. Bradley spoke with the lethal, icy precision of a man who held the absolute, unquestionable backing of the federal government. He informed the deputies that the county guardianship order currently in their hands was the subject of an active, highly sensitive FBI investigation. He laid out the federal stay of execution, pointing directly to the district judge's signature. He then produced the unredacted wire transfer logs and the sealed federal indictment against Dr. Vance and the corrupt municipal judge. The sheriff's arrogant posture evaporated instantly. He scanned the federal seals, his eyes widening as he read the undeniable evidence of wire fraud, judicial bribery, and medical conspiracy. His face went pale. Local law enforcement officers do not argue with federal injunctions, and they absolutely do not execute removal orders signed by judges currently facing imminent federal arrest. The sheriff handed the papers back to Bradley with a shaky hand, signaled sharply to his deputies, and ordered the medical transport teams to stand down immediately. They backed their heavy vehicles out of the ruined yard and drove away, leaving the farm in complete, uninterrupted silence. I stood in the cold mud and watched the red taillights disappear down the winding dirt road. The immediate physical threat was gone, but simply surviving the brutal legal assault was entirely insufficient. Jordan had attempted to erase my autonomy, steal my identity, and lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life just to cover his massive financial crimes. I knew that waiting for the slow grinding gears of the federal bureaucracy to dismantle his life was not enough. I had to destroy his fraudulent empire tonight, directly in front of the ruthless venture capitalists he feared the most. I walked back into the decaying farmhouse and headed straight for the bathroom. I washed the grime, sweat, and freezing rain from my skin, shaving with absolute methodical precision. I walked into the bedroom and opened the heavy cedar closet. Hanging in the very back, preserved perfectly in a dark protective garment bag, was the faded black suit I had worn to Josephine's funeral. I pulled it out and put it on. The fabric was old, but the tailoring was immaculate. Josephine had purchased it for me decades ago. She always told me that a man entering a battlefield should never look like a victim. She anticipated this exact war, and she had armed me with the legal weapons to win it. I adjusted my collar, feeling the heavy weight of the responsibility she had entrusted to me. I walked out of the house, leaving the shattered front door lying exactly where Jordan had kicked it, and climbed into the driver's seat of my truck. Bradley took the passenger side, actively monitoring Jordan's corporate credit expenditures on his encrypted tablet. The drive back to Los Angeles took 4 intense hours. The violent rainstorm had completely washed the sky clean, leaving the sprawling metropolis glittering brightly under the evening lights. Jordan was currently standing in the center of the penthouse drinking expensive champagne. Surrounded by the elite investors, he was actively defrauding. He truly believed I was heavily sedated and strapped to a hospital bed. He was entirely wrong. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly and drove straight into the heart of the city, ready to execute the final phase of Josephine's brilliant trap. I parked the truck 3 blocks away from the luxury high-rise and walked the rest of the distance through the crisp night air. The towering glass structure loomed above the bustling street, radiating immense wealth and unapproachable exclusivity. A long line of expensive exotic cars wrapped entirely around the block, waiting for the overwhelmed valet service. I bypassed the crowded exterior entrance, ignoring the velvet ropes, and walked straight through the revolving glass doors into the pristine marble lobby. The air hummed with the sound of a string quartet playing softly from the upper floors. I walked with steady, unwavering purpose directly toward the private gold-plated elevator bank reserved strictly for the penthouse suite. 2 massive private security guards immediately stepped into my path, their dark designer suits bulging with concealed weapons. The taller guard held up a glowing digital tablet and aggressively informed me that this specific elevator was closed for a highly secure private corporate gala. He demanded to see my identification and stated clearly that I was not on the VIP guest list. He warned me to step back immediately before he called the building authorities to have me physically removed. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or even acknowledge his violent threat. I smoothly sidestepped his heavy frame and reached toward the sleek black panel mounted on the marble wall directly next to the elevator doors. I pressed my right thumb firmly against the glowing glass of the building's master biometric scanner. A thin red laser instantly swept across my skin. The security guards lunged forward to grab my shoulders, but they froze completely. The scanner chimed with a sharp, high-pitched, confirming tone. The red light shifted rapidly to a solid, vibrant green. The digital display above the panel flashed the name of the primary estate trustee with absolute overriding authority. The guards stared in absolute shock, their physical authority completely overridden by the foundational code of the building itself. The heavy gold doors of the elevator silently slid open, waiting to take me to the top. The gold doors parted with a soft chime, instantly swallowing me into a wall of blinding light and deafening noise. The sprawling Los Angeles penthouse was transformed into a glittering sanctuary of manufactured excess. A massive crystal chandelier fractured the city lights, cascading through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Hundreds of men in bespoke tuxedos and women in shimmering designer gowns crowded the expansive, open-concept living space. They held delicate crystal champagne flutes, laughing loudly and exchanging business cards, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic financial illusion they were standing inside. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided seamlessly through the throng, carrying silver trays stacked with caviar and imported spirits. I stepped off the polished marble of the elevator bank and stood at the edge of the sunken living room. No one paid any attention to the older man in the faded black suit. I was a ghost crashing a party of kings. I scanned the room and found my target immediately. Jordan stood at the far end of the penthouse, elevated on a temporary acrylic stage strategically positioned in front of the panoramic city skyline. He looked absolutely radiant. His posture exuded the supreme, untouchable confidence of a Silicon Valley prodigy who had successfully conquered the world. He held a sleek silver microphone addressing the captivated audience of ruthless venture capitalists he had brazenly defrauded. His voice boomed through the hidden surround sound speakers, echoing with practiced, charismatic humility. He was actively weaving a magnificent narrative of pure fiction. Jordan boasted enthusiastically about his alleged self-made success. He spoke passionately about the relentless late nights, the grueling sacrifices, and the visionary genius behind his revolutionary technology startup. He smoothly promised his investors unprecedented quarterly returns, assuring the crowd that their capital was fueling the next great leap in global software innovation. He claimed every dollar of their investment was secured, multiplying rapidly in aggressive overseas markets. He painted himself as a brilliant, unyielding pioneer. I stood near a massive floral arrangement and simply listened to my son lie to the faces of the most dangerous financial predators on the West Coast. He was entirely intoxicated by his own performance, basking in the applause of men who would utterly destroy him if they knew the actual balance of his offshore accounts. I did not have to wait long for the illusion to crack. Through the shifting sea of elegant guests, a sharp flash of stark white caught my eye. Vanessa was weaving through the crowd carrying an empty champagne flute and laughing with a pair of older socialites. She turned her head toward the entryway and stopped dead in her tracks. The radiant, aggressively warm smile she had worn at the farmhouse instantly melted off her face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She completely abandoned her conversation and pushed roughly past a wealthy investor, entirely forgetting her polished manners. She rushed toward me with frantic, erratic steps, her expensive silk gown swishing violently against the marble floor. She closed the distance and lunged at me, her manicured fingers digging viciously into the fabric of my suit arm. Her eyes darted wildly around the room to see if anyone had noticed the sudden intrusion. She pulled me aggressively toward the shadowed alcove near the kitchen entrance, her breath smelling strongly of expensive wine and panic. She did not bother with pleasantries. She hissed at me with raw, venomous desperation, demanding to know how I bypassed the lobby security. She fiercely ordered me to turn around immediately and take the service elevator down to the basement before I embarrassed them in front of the most important financial backers in the state. She spat out that this gala was their final lifeline, and my mere presence was a catastrophic liability. She gripped my arm tighter physically, attempting to drag me backward into the service corridor, treating me exactly like the helpless, confused old man they had successfully diagnosed that morning. I did not move a single inch. I firmly planted my feet onto the polished marble, grounding myself with the absolute certainty of my position. I looked directly into her terrified, wide eyes and smoothly tore my arm away from her frantic grip. A waiter holding a silver tray happened to pass by us at that exact moment. I casually reached out and picked up a simple glass of tap water, ignoring the expensive champagne entirely. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the icy water cool my throat. I looked back at Vanessa and offered a completely flat, emotionless stare. I had absolutely no intention of leaving. The sudden physical struggle in the alcove did not go unnoticed. From his elevated position on the acrylic stage, Jordan's eyes tracked the sudden, jerky movement near the kitchen. I watched his charismatic smile falter for a fraction of a second as he recognized the faded black suit. He saw Vanessa standing in front of me, visibly trembling and completely failing to remove me from the premises. A massive surge of arrogant pride immediately flooded his face. Instead of handling the situation quietly or signaling his private security team to intervene, Jordan made a fatal, deeply arrogant miscalculation. He decided to use my presence to elevate his own fabricated, saintly persona. He tapped the silver microphone, bringing the lively conversations in the room to an immediate halt. The entire crowd turned their attention back to the stage. Jordan pointed a dramatic, deeply sympathetic finger directly at me. He projected a heavy, sorrowful sigh through the audio system, ensuring every single investor hung on his next word. He announced to the glittering room that he had a deeply personal confession to make regarding the burdens of success. He gestured toward the alcove and boldly introduced me as his severely sick, hopelessly confused father. He painted a tragic picture of my sudden cognitive decline, claiming I had wandered into the city completely disoriented. He proudly declared to the wealthy audience that despite the immense pressure of running a global technology startup, he fully supported me financially out of the sheer goodness of his heart. A collective murmur of profound sympathy rippled through the crowd of investors, thoroughly impressed by the young executive's boundless filial devotion. Jordan looked down at me from his platform, an ugly, triumphant sneer barely concealed beneath his mask of sorrow. He firmly believed he had completely neutralized the threat, turning my sudden appearance into a powerful public relations victory. I lowered the glass of water and placed it gently onto a passing silver tray. I did not break eye contact with my son. I adjusted the lapels of Josephine's immaculate black suit, stepped out of the shadows, and began walking directly through the parted crowd toward the brightly lit stage. I moved with measured, unhurried steps through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. The guests parted instinctively, creating a wide, silent path down the center of the glittering room. They looked at me with a mixture of morbid curiosity and polite pity, entirely convinced by the tragic fiction Jordan had just spun from the stage. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not throw a frantic tantrum to prove my sanity. A desperate man screams, but a man holding all the cards simply acts. I stopped exactly in the center of the expansive living room, perfectly positioned under the massive crystal chandelier. I stood completely still, letting the heavy silence stretch and amplify the tension. Jordan remained on the acrylic platform, his arrogant smirk frozen in place, waiting for the confused old man to finally break down and validate his cruel narrative. Instead of speaking to him, I turned my back on the stage entirely. I looked toward the heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the penthouse and raised my right hand, giving a single sharp nod. The doors swung open with a heavy thud. Bradley walked into the ballroom. He did not look like a guest. He moved with the cold, predatory precision of a corporate executioner. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his expression completely devoid of emotion. In his hands he carried a heavy stack of glossy black folders. Each folder was perfectly bound and sealed with the silver crest of his Los Angeles law firm. The soft murmurs of the crowd died instantly. The sudden synchronized movement between Bradley and myself shattered the illusion of my supposed dementia. I was not wandering aimlessly. I was executing a highly coordinated tactical strike directly inside Jordan's fortress. Bradley walked straight down the cleared path, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. He stopped beside me and turned to face the crowd of elite venture capitalists. He did not hand the stack of folders to me. He held them out like a deck of lethal cards, waiting for my explicit command. I turned my attention back to the audience, my eyes scanning the faces of the men and women who had poured their fortunes into my son's web of lies. I located the target immediately. Standing in the front row, mere feet from the stage, was Marcus Sterling. He was the lead investor, a notoriously ruthless venture capitalist who had personally bankrolled Jordan's technology startup. Sterling was a man who built his empire by crushing weak investments and tearing apart corporate fraudsters. I reached out, took the top glossy black folder from Bradley's stack, and stepped directly into Sterling's personal space. I did not offer a polite greeting or a preamble. I extended my arm and pressed the heavy folder directly into his chest. Sterling looked at me, his brow furrowing in deep irritation, but his predatory instincts took over. He took the folder and flipped open the heavy black cover. Inside lay the complete, unredacted forensic audit generated by Josephine's data center. The very first page displayed a devastatingly clear flowchart. It traced the exact digital trajectory of $4 million, moving directly from Sterling's venture capital trust fund into Jordan's hidden offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. It included the precise timestamps, the international routing numbers, and the corresponding IP addresses, verifying Jordan as the sole authorized user. I watched Sterling's face drain of all color. The arrogant, wealthy flush in his cheeks vanished, replaced by the stark, chalky pallor of a man realizing he had been completely robbed. His eyes darted rapidly across the pages, absorbing the undeniable magnitude of the embezzlement. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched violently under his skin. He did not say a word to me. He aggressively shoved the open folder toward the two senior partners standing immediately to his right. They leaned in their eyes, scanning the highlighted offshore accounts and the undeniable proof of grand larceny. The polite, refined atmosphere of the penthouse completely evaporated. A low, dangerous hiss of whispers erupted through the ballroom. The information spread like a virus through the crowd of elite investors. Bradley began moving through the room with absolute efficiency, silently handing out the remaining black folders to every major financial backer present. The guests dropped their polite facades instantly. Men and women huddled over the damning documents pointing at the offshore routing codes. The ambient music from the string quartet was entirely drowned out by the harsh, venomous murmurs of wealthy predators, realizing they were the victims of a massive Ponzi scheme. From his elevated position on the stage, Jordan finally realized the catastrophic shift in the room's dynamic. He saw the black folders. He saw the furious, murderous glares of his most critical financial backers turning toward him. The smug, triumphant expression completely melted off his face, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He rushed off the acrylic platform, stumbling over the microphone cord in a desperate bid to regain control of the narrative. He forced a high-strained laugh, holding his hands up defensively. He stammered into the microphone loudly, insisting that this was all a massive, ridiculous misunderstanding. He claimed the documents were the fabricated ravings of a sick, confused old man begging the investors not to pay attention to the folders. Marcus Sterling stepped forward, completely ignoring Jordan's frantic, pathetic pleas. Sterling raised his right hand, tightly gripping his crystal champagne flute. With a sudden, explosive motion, Sterling hurled the delicate glass directly onto the hard marble floor. The crystal shattered violently, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot through the silent penthouse. The shards scattered across the floor, completely halting Jordan's approach. Sterling pointed a rigid, furious finger directly at my son's chest. He did not ask for an explanation. He demanded immediate, total financial accountability. He listed the exact routing numbers from the Cayman Islands accounts, his voice booming with lethal authority. He demanded to know exactly where his $4 million was sitting. The other investors instantly closed in, surrounding the stage like a pack of starving wolves. The luxurious million-dollar party instantly devolved into a hostile, aggressive interrogation. The polite smiles and clinking glasses were entirely replaced by shouted threats of federal lawsuits, immediate contract terminations, and imminent arrests. Jordan backed away, shrinking against the floor-to-ceiling windows, completely trapped by the very people he had invited to celebrate his genius. I stood quietly beside Bradley, watching the beautiful, glittering empire of lies burn to the ground. I stepped aside, yielding the floor to the man who held the legal execution order. Bradley moved smoothly into the exact center of the penthouse, positioning himself directly beneath the massive crystal chandelier. He did not need a microphone to command the room. His voice resonated with the devastating, practiced authority of a man accustomed to dismantling corporate empires. He raised a single hand, demanding absolute silence from the circling pack of furious venture capitalists. Bradley loudly announced that the $18 million property they were currently standing inside did not belong to Jordan. He declared with surgical precision that the penthouse was the exclusive, non-transferable property of the Sylvia Estate Trust. He explained the intricate legal reality to the stunned crowd, revealing that Jordan held absolutely zero equity in the real estate. My son was nothing more than a temporary occupant, living on borrowed time and stolen money. Bradley detailed the mechanics of the frozen international transaction, exposing Jordan's desperate attempt to liquidate an asset he had no legal authority to sell. The investors stared at the gleaming marble floors and the panoramic windows, suddenly realizing that the very foundation of Jordan's perceived wealth was an elaborate illusion. The lavish party was entirely funded by their stolen capital, hosted inside a stolen fortress. Jordan stood frozen against the glass, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The undeniable truth stripped away his final layer of defense. He had leveraged the penthouse as a primary guarantee to secure his massive venture capital loans. Bradley systematically dismantled that lie, explicitly informing the lead investors that their collateral was entirely non-existent. The Sylvia Estate Trust was locked down by a federal injunction, rendering Jordan's corporate guarantees completely fraudulent. The wealthy men and women in the room realized their multi-million-dollar investments were completely unsecured, vanished into offshore accounts with zero physical assets backing them up. The atmosphere in the room shifted from hostile interrogation to pure, litigious bloodlust. The venture capitalists turned their furious glares back to Jordan, understanding that he had not just mismanaged their funds, but had orchestrated a deliberate, premeditated financial trap. The entire facade of his brilliant technology startup was nothing more than a desperate scheme to siphon their wealth into his own failing pockets. Bradley did not give Jordan a single second to formulate a defensive lie. He reached inside his tailored charcoal jacket and withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope. He walked directly up to Jordan, who was pressing himself flat against the floor-to-ceiling glass, and slammed the heavy document squarely into his chest. Bradley officially served him with a massive, multi-tiered civil lawsuit. He announced the charges loudly, ensuring every investor in the room heard the full spectrum of Jordan's criminality. The lawsuit detailed explicit counts of elder abuse, systematic financial fraud, and gross corporate embezzlement. Jordan stared down at the envelope in his trembling hands, his face a portrait of absolute unrecoverable ruin. He was legally and financially trapped, with nowhere left to run. From the edge of the crowd, a shrill, hysterical voice suddenly cut through the heavy tension. Vanessa pushed her way past the imposing venture capitalists, her designer gown snagging on the shattered crystal fragments littering the floor. Her face was twisted into a mask of sheer panic and unhinged fury. She screamed over the ambient noise, desperately clinging to her final fabricated lifeline. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that they held a legally binding power of attorney. She claimed to the entire room that I had signed away my rights, demanding that Bradley's injunctions be ignored. She shrieked that they possessed the full legal authority to override my decisions and finalize the Penthouse sale. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my faded black suit and retrieved my mobile phone. I tapped the screen, opening the secure audio file I had recorded at the farmhouse. I turned the volume to its absolute maximum capacity and hit play. The clear, undeniable sound of Vanessa's own voice echoed sharply across the silent, cavernous room. The recording captured her exact words from the farmhouse hallway, excitedly bragging to Jordan about securing the forged signature on the fake utility bills. The audio explicitly detailed their coordinated scheme to trick a supposedly senile old man into signing away his absolute autonomy. The digital recording laid their entire conspiracy bare in front of the city's most powerful financial predators. Vanessa froze mid-scream, her jaw dropping open as her own venomous words permanently sealed her fate. The sheer malice in her recorded voice shattered any remaining doubt regarding their guilt. The lead investor, Marcus Sterling, did not need to hear another word. He turned his back on Jordan with a look of profound, absolute disgust. Sterling signaled sharply to his associates, pulling his mobile phone from his jacket and immediately dialing his corporate legal team. The rest of the venture capitalists followed suit in a rapid, synchronized wave. They pushed past Jordan and Vanessa without a single glance of pity, storming toward the golden elevator bank. They aggressively dialed their respective attorneys, shouting frantic orders to freeze accounts, seize assets, and initiate immediate litigation. The grand ballroom emptied with staggering speed. The pristine waiters and private security guards abandoned their posts, realizing the lavish gala was nothing more than a sinking ship. Within a matter of minutes, the sprawling, opulent penthouse was entirely deserted. The massive crystal chandelier illuminated a landscape of shattered glass, discarded champagne flutes, and absolute silence. Only 4 people remained standing in the center of the ruined estate. I stood beside Bradley, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting comfortably at my sides. Jordan collapsed onto his knees, dropping the heavy lawsuit envelope onto the marble floor, his hands gripping his hair in a state of total catatonic shock. Vanessa stood frozen near the kitchen alcove, staring blankly at the ground, completely unable to process the absolute destruction of her fabricated reality. They had traded their morality for a fortune, and they were left with nothing but the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. I looked down at the son I had raised, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of finality. The war was over. The silence in the penthouse was suddenly broken by a harsh, rhythmic strobing from the street far below. The vibrant, flashing red and blue lights of federal police cruisers cut through the Los Angeles night. The intense beams swept upward, aggressively illuminating the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite. The authorities had not come for me. The federal agents had arrived to collect their targets. The heavy gold doors of the private elevator slid apart with a sharp mechanical hum, breaking the suffocating silence of the ruined ballroom. A tactical team of federal agents stepped onto the pristine marble floor, their dark windbreakers a stark contrast to the glittering remnants of the shattered gala. They did not walk with the hurried panic of local police. They moved with the methodical, inevitable weight of the United States government. The lead agent, a tall man with a severe expression and a thick leather portfolio tucked under his arm, bypassed the scattered crystal shards and walked directly toward the center of the room. He did not ask for permission to speak. He loudly identified himself to the empty room, his voice echoing off the panoramic windows. He unsealed a thick stack of federal warrants and began reading the devastating legal reality directly to Jordan and Vanessa. He announced that effective immediately, every single domestic and international financial account connected to Jordan's technology startup was entirely frozen under federal mandate. The agent meticulously listed the routing numbers of the Cayman Islands shell corporations, the Panamanian holding trusts, and the local corporate credit lines. He stated with absolute clarity that the Department of Justice had seized all remaining liquid assets to preserve capital for the defrauded investors. The sheer magnitude of the federal freeze meant that Jordan could not access a single dollar to flee the country, purchase a plane ticket, or even buy a cup of coffee. Vanessa stood paralyzed near the kitchen alcove, listening to the agent systematically dismantle the financial empire she had married into. Her eyes darted wildly as the federal officer detailed the impending criminal charges of wire fraud, judicial bribery, and federal conspiracy. The intoxicating illusion of endless wealth completely evaporated from her mind, replaced by the terrifying, undeniable reality of a federal penitentiary. She stared at the agents securing the perimeter of the penthouse, watching them physically lock down the exits. The glamorous life she had brutally fought for, the life she had actively conspired to steal from a supposedly senile old man, was entirely gone. There were no hidden emergency funds left to salvage. There was no secret offshore account remaining untouched. She recognized the catastrophic finality of the federal warrants. Prison was no longer a distant, abstract threat. It was standing directly inside her living room. The overwhelming weight of imminent federal incarceration triggered a sudden violent shift within Vanessa. In a fraction of a second, her polished socialite demeanor vanished completely, revealing the raw, ruthless instinct of pure self-preservation. She looked at Jordan, who was still kneeling helplessly on the marble floor, and made a brutally calculated decision to sever all ties. She did not offer him a word of comfort or a gesture of solidarity. She turned her back on her husband and lunged aggressively toward the lead federal agent. Her voice ripped through the quiet penthouse, rising into a shrill, hysterical shriek. She pointed an accusing finger directly at Jordan and loudly declared her complete innocence. She screamed that she had absolutely no knowledge of the embezzled venture capital funds or the fraudulent offshore shell companies. Without a single moment of hesitation, she actively weaponized the forgery scheme to save herself. She frantically insisted to the federal authorities that Jordan was a violently abusive manipulator who had physically forced her to participate in the forgery of the medical documents. She claimed she acted entirely under extreme duress, portraying herself as a terrified victim trapped in his criminal web. Jordan lifted his head from his hands, staring at his wife in sheer, uncomprehending horror as she systematically fed him to the federal authorities. Vanessa did not stop at criminal accusations. She loudly announced to the room, ensuring the agents and Bradley heard every single word, that she was filing for an immediate total divorce. She stated fiercely that she would fully cooperate with the federal investigation, promising to surrender every piece of evidence she possessed against her husband in exchange for complete legal immunity. She spun around, snatching her expensive designer purse from a nearby marble counter. She did not cast a single backward glance at the man she had conspired with. She practically sprinted past the federal agents, her high heels clacking rapidly against the floor, and marched straight into the open elevator. She slammed her hand against the lobby button, desperate to escape the blast radius of Jordan's collapsing life. The heavy gold doors slid shut, sealing her frantic retreat. She left her husband kneeling in the center of the shattered ballroom, entirely alone, completely isolated, and utterly defenseless against the crushing weight of the federal justice system. The absolute desertion by his wife shattered the very last remnant of Jordan's arrogant facade. The brilliant, untouchable tech visionary was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating criminal facing decades behind bars. His physical strength completely abandoned him. His knees buckled violently, sending him crashing forward onto the hard marble floor. He crawled awkwardly through the scattered shards of crystal, ignoring the sharp glass tearing into his expensive tuxedo trousers. He dragged himself directly to my feet, his shoulders heaving with ragged, desperate sobs. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and sweat, completely stripped of his pride. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately clutching the hem of my faded black suit. He begged me with a pathetic, broken voice to save him from the federal authorities. He pleaded for a massive financial loan, desperately demanding millions of dollars to secure a high-profile criminal defense attorney. He promised to repay every single cent, swearing frantically that he could rebuild his empire if I just gave him one final chance. He cried that he was my only son, weaponizing the very family bond he had so ruthlessly attempted to exploit and destroy. I did not step away from his frantic grasp. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy silence of the ruined penthouse amplify his pathetic begging cries. I reached into my pocket and slowly withdrew the heavy brass master keys to the Sylvia Estate Trust. The metallic clink of the keys drew his desperate gaze upward. I looked down at the man who had actively conspired to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my home and my autonomy. I held the keys firmly in my palm, feeling the cold, undeniable weight of the authority Josephine had entrusted to me. The federal agents waited silently near the perimeter, allowing me the final necessary moment of closure. I looked directly into my son's terrified, tear-filled eyes, completely ready to deliver the final, irrevocable verdict on the life he had chosen to live. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy brass keys dig deeply into my palm. Jordan remained on his knees, his expensive designer tuxedo ruined by the spilled champagne and crystal shards weeping for salvation. He looked up at me with desperate, bloodshot eyes, waiting for the unconditional paternal forgiveness he had exploited his entire natural life. He fully expected the father he had always manipulated to suddenly reappear and shield him from the crushing consequences of his own boundless arrogance. I felt absolutely nothing for the pathetic creature groveling on the marble floor. The man kneeling before me was not my son. He was a ruthless corporate predator who had actively conspired to erase my existence. I did not show an ounce of pity. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic emotional speech. I spoke with absolute razor-sharp clarity, ensuring the federal agents standing at the perimeter heard every single syllable. "You pushed me out into the freezing rain," I stated quietly, my voice slicing effortlessly through his frantic sobbing. "You stood in the mud and told me I was a worthless, broken old man. You tried to erase my mind, Jordan. You paid corrupt doctors and bribed local judges to lock me inside a psychiatric ward until I died." Jordan opened his mouth to protest, to spin another desperate, fabricated lie, but the sheer coldness in my eyes silenced him instantly. I gripped the brass keys tighter. Josephine built her infrastructure with honor and relentless hard work. You tried to cannibalize your mother's legacy to cover your pathetic gambling and reckless embezzlement. You engineered an elaborate, malicious conspiracy to steal everything we built. You traded your morality, your family, and your own soul just to impress a room full of venture capitalists who abandoned you the second your fraud was exposed. I took a deliberate step back, physically severing the remaining distance between us. The desperate hope completely drained from his pale face. He finally understood that the absolute limit of my endurance had been permanently crossed. There would be no rescue, no financial bailout, and no legal protection. "I am not sending you to prison," I told him, delivering the final devastating truth. "I simply refuse to let you bury me. Your own bottomless greed built this cage, and your own arrogance locked the door." I turned my back on him completely and walked deliberately toward the lead federal agent. The tall officer stepped forward to meet me halfway across the ruined ballroom. Bradley stood silently by the panoramic windows, holding a sleek silver flash drive and a thick-bound dossier containing the absolute entirety of Josephine's data center records. I took the heavy dossier from Bradley and handed the physical documents directly to the federal agent. "These are the remaining server farm logs," I stated firmly. "They contain the unredacted digital footprint of every single offshore wire transfer, the fabricated corporate invoices, and the explicit communications coordinating the medical forgery. It details every cent of his $4 million embezzlement down to the exact second." The agent accepted the heavy file with a curt professional nod, understanding the staggering legal value of the flawless forensic audit I had just freely surrendered. He signaled sharply to his tactical team. 4 heavily armed agents moved immediately toward the center of the room. They did not treat Jordan with the delicate reverence he was accustomed to. 2 agents grabbed him roughly by the shoulders, hauling him forcefully to his feet. Jordan's legs gave out entirely, completely unable to support his own weight. The agents dragged him upright, spinning him around to face the shattered windows. The sharp, heavy metallic clack of steel handcuffs echoing through the penthouse signaled the absolute end of his fraudulent empire. They locked the heavy restraints tightly around his wrists, completely neutralizing his physical freedom. The lead agent read him his Miranda rights in a flat, mechanical drone, a stark, humiliating contrast to the glamorous speeches Jordan had delivered from the acrylic stage just 20 minutes earlier. The officers marched him aggressively across the marble floor, his ruined shoes dragging through the wreckage of his own party. He walked with a hollow, vacant stare, his posture entirely defeated. He did not fight. He did not cry out for his wife, who had already abandoned him to save herself. And as the agents shoved him into the waiting elevator, Jordan did not cast a single look back at me. The heavy gold doors slid shut, sealing him inside the steel box that would carry him directly down to the federal transport vehicles waiting on the street below. The mechanical chime of the descending elevator faded into nothingness. The heavy, profound silence of the sprawling penthouse returned, pressing down on the empty space. The glittering ballroom designed to host the absolute elite of Los Angeles now felt like a massive, hollow tomb. The scattered crystal fragments caught the flashing red and blue lights from the street below, casting eerie, rotating shadows across the pristine white walls. Bradley packed his encrypted tablet into his leather briefcase, offering a single respectful nod before quietly letting himself out through the service corridor. I stood entirely alone in the center of the $18 million fortress. I walked slowly toward the towering floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling, illuminated skyline. Millions of lights stretched toward the dark horizon, representing endless ambition, ruthless competition, and relentless greed. It was a world Jordan had desperately craved, a world that had consumed him entirely. The war was officially over. I held the heavy brass keys to the Sylvia Estate Trust tightly in my hand. I had successfully defended my autonomy, protected Josephine's legacy, and dismantled the criminal conspiracy meant to bury me. I possessed absolute, unchallenged ownership of the most exclusive real estate in the city. I could live the rest of my days surrounded by manufactured luxury and breathtaking views. I looked at the cold glass, the sharp angles, and the sterile perfection of the penthouse. This was not a home. It was a monument to vanity. My true sanctuary was 300 miles away in the Central Valley, surrounded by towering oak trees, freezing rain, and the quiet, steady hum of Josephine's servers working diligently in the dark aluminum barn. I had fought a brutal legal war not to conquer this concrete metropolis, but to secure the absolute freedom to leave it behind. I placed the heavy brass keys squarely on the cold marble of the kitchen island, completely abandoning the fortune Jordan had destroyed his life to claim. I turned my back on the glittering artificial skyline and walked purposefully toward the exit, ready to go home. The sprawling Los Angeles penthouse was transformed from an active crime scene into a highly lucrative asset over the course of 14 grueling legal days. Bradley and I spent those 2 weeks meticulously dismantling the intricate financial traps Jordan had embedded in the Sylvia Estate Trust. We sat in Bradley's immaculate downtown office, executing a relentless series of federal motions to permanently wipe away the fraudulent corporate debts Jordan had tied to the property. The federal court swiftly nullified every single illegal lien, recognizing the absolute validity of Josephine's original directives. The lead federal investigator personally verified that every cent Jordan had embezzled was successfully frozen and returned to Marcus Sterling's venture capital firm. Sterling immediately withdrew his aggressive civil claims against the estate, recognizing that my forensic audit had saved his fund from total ruin. With the financial bleeding completely stopped, I had a massive piece of prime real estate sitting entirely empty. I had zero intention of ever living in that glass fortress. Bradley arranged a high-priority meeting with an elite, highly discreet property management firm that specialized in handling ultra-luxury corporate assets. I handed them full operational control of the $18 million penthouse. They moved with remarkable speed, matching the property to a highly respectable diplomatic family seeking an immediate long-term residence in the city. I sat at a heavy mahogany conference table and signed the ironclad lease agreement. The monthly rent secured by the diplomatic consulate was staggering, creating a massive, uninterrupted stream of legitimate income that flowed directly back into the estate's protected accounts. Jordan had viewed the penthouse as a flashy prop to inflate his fragile ego and con his investors. Josephine had built it as an absolute financial fortress, and I was finally utilizing it exactly as she had intended. The ink dried on the final contract, permanently closing the door on the urban chaos Jordan had violently dragged me into. Bradley closed his heavy leather briefcase and offered a firm, respectful handshake. He assured me the federal prosecutors were handling the criminal trials of my son and Vanessa with overwhelming evidence, and my active participation was no longer required. The legal guillotine had fallen with absolute finality. The dust had finally settled, leaving my financial autonomy completely untouchable. I returned to the temporary hotel suite Bradley had secured for me during the legal proceedings and packed my single canvas duffel bag. It took less than 5 minutes. I folded the faded black suit I had worn to Josephine's funeral, placing it carefully inside a protective garment bag. It had served its purpose perfectly, projecting absolute authority when my enemies expected weakness. I did not take a single item from the penthouse before the diplomats moved in. I left the sterile modern furniture, the expensive abstract artwork, and the cold marble counters exactly as they were. That environment belonged to a world of manufactured prestige and ruthless social climbing. It was a world I fundamentally rejected. I slung the duffel bag over my shoulder, walked out of the hotel lobby, and climbed into the driver's seat of my rusted truck. The engine turned over with a reliable heavy rumble. I pulled out onto the congested Los Angeles freeway, merging smoothly into the northbound lanes. I left the towering glass skyscrapers and the suffocating traffic far behind me. The violent rainstorms that had battered the coast for weeks were completely gone. The sky above the highway opened up into a brilliant, cloudless expanse of vibrant blue. The drive back to the Central Valley was profoundly peaceful. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt served as a steady meditation, washing away the lingering tension of the past month. I watched the dense urban sprawl gradually transition into rolling golden hills and vast open agricultural fields. The air filtering through the cracked window shifted from the acrid smell of city exhaust to the rich, earthy scent of damp soil and growing crops. I gripped the worn leather steering wheel, feeling a deep, quiet strength settling into my bones. Jordan had tried to convince me that I was a broken old man, obsolete and incapable of surviving without his charitable intervention. He had tried to strip away my dignity and lock me away in a sterile cage. The miles melting away beneath my tires proved the absolute fallacy of his arrogance. I was returning to the land I loved with my mind sharp, my autonomy secured, and my freedom completely intact. I watched the familiar highway markers approach, signaling the final turnoff toward the farm. The war in the city was a closed chapter. The heavy tires of my truck crunched loudly against the familiar gravel of the long, winding driveway. I parked near the twisted remains of the old wooden fence, shutting off the engine and letting the profound quiet of the rural landscape envelop me entirely. I stepped out into the crisp, clean air and walked directly toward the massive aluminum barn sitting at the edge of the sprawling property. The structure looked entirely unassuming from the outside, appearing to the untrained eye to be nothing more than a weathered, forgotten agricultural storage facility. I pressed my right thumb firmly against the biometric scanner hidden beneath the rusted metal plate. The heavy steel doors unlocked with a solid, echoing mechanical clank. I grabbed the heavy handle, pulled the reinforced doors open, and stepped inside the humming climate-controlled sanctuary. The endless rows of high-performance servers hummed steadily in the background, emitting a cool, rhythmic vibration that pulsed directly through the thick concrete floor. The thousands of tiny blue lights blinked rapidly in the dim room, silently processing massive streams of global financial data at blinding speeds. This was Josephine's true masterpiece. It was a billion-dollar technological empire brilliantly disguised as dirt mud and rusted metal, securely hidden away from the greedy, searching eyes of the world, and it was now entirely mine to manage, protect, and grow. I stood in the exact center of the vast server farm, taking a long moment to honor the brilliant woman who had meticulously built this digital fortress to ensure my survival. She had anticipated the greed of our son, and she had armed me with the ultimate weapon. I stepped back outside and pushed the heavy steel doors shut, locking the data center down securely. I walked across the damp, fragrant earth toward the old weathered farmhouse. The splintered front door Jordan had kicked in remained exactly as we had left it, a final, fading physical scar of a vicious battle already won. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my heavy brass key, and unlocked the sturdy deadbolt. I pushed the wooden door open and stepped over the threshold, finally returning to the quiet, unshakable peace of my own home. The winter rains gave way to the relentless heat of the Central Valley summer and then softened into a mild, golden autumn. 6 months had passed since the night I locked the steel doors of Josephine's data center and walked back into the ruined farmhouse. I did not hire a construction crew to repair the damage Jordan had inflicted. I am a structural engineer. I spent my entire professional life designing skeletons of steel and concrete for commercial high-rises. Rebuilding a wooden farmhouse was not a burden. It was a necessary physical meditation. I started with the foundation, reinforcing the aging joists beneath the floorboards. I completely replaced the splintered front door, hanging a solid oak slab on heavy brass hinges. I spent weeks up on the roof replacing the weather-beaten shingles, sealing every leak that the violent winter storms had exposed. The most significant work went into the wraparound porch. I stripped away the rotted planks, sanded down the supporting beams, and applied deep, rich coats of weather-resistant sealant. The wood now gleamed perfectly under the afternoon sun, sturdy and inviting. Beneath the restored farmhouse, the hidden aluminum barn continued its silent, massive labor. The automated high-frequency trading algorithms Josephine had coded operated with flawless precision. The liquid cooling systems hummed quietly, generating a staggering daily revenue stream that completely dwarfed my pension. Combined with the massive monthly lease payments from the diplomatic consulate occupying the Los Angeles penthouse, the estate possessed more liquid capital than it ever had before. But I had absolutely no desire to hoard this wealth. Money without purpose is just a different kind of cage. I worked closely with Bradley to establish a comprehensive legal and financial trust. We officially launched the Josephine Sylvia Foundation. We dedicated the overwhelming profits of the estate entirely to a single cause. We hired a ruthless team of forensic accountants and aggressive litigators to represent elderly victims facing family financial abuse. The foundation provided absolute legal protection for men and women who were being systematically stripped of their assets, their homes, and their dignity by the very people they had raised. We fought the quiet, invisible wars happening in living rooms and bank branches across the state. Josephine had built a digital fortress to protect me. I was now using her brilliant legacy to protect thousands of others. The farmhouse was finally fully restored, and for the first time in years, the property felt truly alive. A sleek black sedan turned off the main county road, its tires crunching steadily up the long gravel driveway. I stood on the newly reinforced porch holding a steaming mug of black coffee. Bradley parked near the massive oak tree and stepped out into the crisp morning air. He had traded his usual immaculate courtroom suits for a casual linen jacket, looking far more relaxed than I had ever seen him. He walked up the sturdy wooden steps, admiring the polished oak and the flawless joinery of the restored railings. I handed him a freshly poured mug. We sat down in the heavy wooden rocking chairs facing the sprawling agricultural fields. Bradley did not come all the way to the Central Valley merely to inspect my carpentry. He came to deliver the final casualty reports from a battlefield we had left far behind. He took a slow sip of his coffee and laid out the absolute conclusion of the legal war. The federal prosecutors had built an insurmountable case against my son. Confronted with the unredacted server farm logs, the undeniable proof of offshore wire fraud, and the explicit audio recordings of their conspiracy, the defense had completely collapsed. Bradley informed me that Jordan had officially waived his right to a trial. 2 days ago, he had signed a comprehensive plea agreement. He accepted a mandatory 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, completely forfeiting any possibility of early parole. The brilliant tech visionary who had rented out a penthouse to impress his defrauded investors was now an assigned number in the federal penal system. Bradley then shifted the subject to Vanessa. Her desperate attempt to secure total immunity by betraying her husband had failed spectacularly. The federal agents had frozen every single account bearing her name. The luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, and the extravagant jewelry were entirely repossessed to satisfy the outstanding venture capital liens. Stripped of her stolen wealth and facing immense legal penalties, Vanessa had entirely avoided prison but inherited a completely ruined life. Bradley stated that she was currently working a minimum wage retail position at a suburban shopping mall. Her entire paycheck was being aggressively garnished to pay down the massive high-interest credit card debts she had recklessly accumulated during her brief illusion of elite status. I listened to the devastating summary of their ruined lives. I did not smile. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication or a desire to gloat over their absolute downfall. I simply looked out at the quiet sunlit fields and gave a single slow nod. The ledger was permanently balanced. Bradley stayed for another hour discussing the rapid expansion of the Josephine Sylvia Foundation and the growing list of vulnerable clients we were successfully defending. When the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, he stood up, offered a firm handshake, and walked back to his sedan. I watched his car kick up a faint trail of dust as it drove away, eventually disappearing onto the main county road. The property settled back into a profound, undisturbed quiet. I remained seated on the porch. The brutal summer heat gave way to the cool, crisp evening air. The sprawling agricultural fields stretched out before me, painting a vibrant landscape of rich greens and deep amber under the spectacular golden hour light. The air was entirely clean, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and blooming orange blossoms. The silence enveloping the farm was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was no longer a weapon wielded by an arrogant son trying to isolate and break me. The silence was now a profound, protective comfort. I listened closely and could hear the faint, steady, rhythmic hum vibrating deep beneath the soil. It was the sound of Josephine's brilliance executing thousands of calculations per second, generating the power required to defend the defenseless. I realized then that I had accomplished far more than merely surviving a vicious, calculated betrayal. I had successfully protected the absolute dignity of my life's work. I had refused to allow my identity to be erased and my autonomy to be stolen by boundless greed. More importantly, I had actively honored the quiet, unparalleled genius of the woman I loved. I had transformed her hidden digital fortress into a lasting shield for those who could not fight for themselves. The shadows lengthened across the wooden porch as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, pulling a blanket of stars over the central valley. I leaned back in the heavy rocking chair. I raised my mug, taking a slow, deep sip of the dark coffee. For the first time in years, I was completely at peace. The federal prosecutors had built an insurmountable case against my son. Confronted with the unredacted server farm logs, the undeniable proof of offshore wire fraud, and the explicit audio recordings of their conspiracy, the defense had completely collapsed. Bradley informed me that Jordan had officially waived his right to a trial. 2 days ago, he had signed a comprehensive plea agreement. He accepted a mandatory 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, completely forfeiting any possibility of early parole. Bradley then shifted the subject to Vanessa. Her desperate attempt to secure total immunity by betraying her husband had failed spectacularly. The federal agents had frozen every single account bearing her name. The luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, and the extravagant jewelry were entirely repossessed to satisfy the outstanding venture capital liens. Stripped of her stolen wealth and facing immense legal penalties, Vanessa had entirely avoided prison, but inherited a completely ruined life. Bradley stated that she was currently working a minimum wage retail position at a suburban shopping mall. Her entire paycheck was being aggressively garnished to pay down the massive high-interest credit card debts she had recklessly accumulated during her brief illusion of elite status. I listened to the devastating summary of their ruined lives. I did not smile. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication or a desire to gloat over their absolute downfall. I simply looked out at the quiet, sunlit fields and gave a single slow nod. The ledger was permanently balanced. Bradley stayed for another hour discussing the rapid expansion of the foundation and the growing list of vulnerable clients we were successfully defending. When the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, he stood up, offered a firm handshake, and walked back to his sedan. I watched his car kick up a faint trail of dust as it drove away, eventually disappearing onto the main county road. The property settled back into a profound, undisturbed quiet. I remained seated on the porch. The brutal summer heat gave way to the cool, crisp evening air. The sprawling agricultural fields stretched out before me, painting a vibrant landscape of rich greens and deep amber under the spectacular golden hour light. The air was entirely clean, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and blooming orange blossoms. The silence enveloping the farm was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was no longer a weapon wielded by an arrogant son trying to isolate and break me. The silence was now a profound, protective comfort. I listened closely and could hear the faint, steady, rhythmic hum vibrating deep beneath the soil. It was the sound of Josephine's brilliance executing thousands of calculations per second, generating the power required to defend the defenseless. I realized then that I had accomplished far more than merely surviving a vicious, calculated betrayal. I had successfully protected the absolute dignity of my life's work. I had refused to allow my identity to be erased and my autonomy to be stolen by boundless greed. More importantly, I had actively honored the quiet, unparalleled genius of the woman I loved. I had transformed her hidden digital fortress into a lasting shield for those who could not fight for themselves. The shadows lengthened across the wooden porch as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, pulling a blanket of stars over the central valley. I leaned back in the heavy rocking chair. I raised my mug, taking a slow, deep sip of the dark coffee, finally at peace. True strength is not measured by the volume of your anger, but by the precision of your response. When betrayed by those who should protect you, the greatest victory is not found in their destruction, but in the preservation of your own dignity. Greed blinds people to the true value of love and loyalty, reducing profound human connections to mere transactions. By refusing to become a victim, you reclaim your power and establish unshakable boundaries. Ultimately, absolute peace is not the absence of conflict, but the quiet, unyielding certainty that you have fiercely protected everything that truly matters in life. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel, Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Frederick's journey and share this video with anyone who values justice, dignity, and resilience.